You wait before the grey light touches the single window of the cottage, your eyes opening not to any sound or disturbance, but to the simple fact that the body knows when rest has finished, and the day must begin again. The air is cold against your face, while the rest of you stays wrapped in the rough wool blanket that has covered you for 14 winters now, a blanket woven by your own mother on a loom that stood in the corner of a cottage, much like this one in a village 3 days' walk to the north. The room around you is silent except for the soft breathing of your 3 children sleeping in the loft above, a sound so faint it blends with the rustle of thatch in the wind outside and the small scratchings of a mouse somewhere in the wall near the chimney stones. Your bare feet find the cold, packed earth floor, and you move slowly across the dark room with your hand outstretched to touch the familiar surfaces that guide you. The edge of the wooden table smooth from 100 years of hands wiping across it, the cool iron of the pot hanging from its hook in the hearth, the rough stones of the chimney breast still holding a faint memory of yesterday's warmth. You kneel before the hearth where last night's coals have turned to white ash, and a single faint orange glow remains hidden beneath the grey powder like a secret kept safe through the long darkness. The routine of kneeling here in the cold before anyone else is awake belongs to you alone and has for 3 years now, since the wet spring of 1674 when the fever came and took your husband and left you with 3 children and a cottage, and the necessity of rising first each morning to coax the fire back to life. You blow gently on the ember and the orange deepens to red and a tiny curl of smoke rises, and you feed it dried moss gathered from the stone wall in late summer, when the moss was brittle and grey-green and pulled away in soft sheets that you stored in a clay pot beside the hearth. The moss catches and flames in a small bright burst that warms your face for a moment, and then you add twigs of hazel cut last autumn and stored in a bundle under the eaves where the rain cannot reach them. Twigs no thicker than your smallest finger that snap and pop as the fire takes hold and grows from a flicker to a steady flame. You add a split log of beech wood from the pile against the western wall, a log cut 2 winters past by her husband when his hands were still strong and the axe swung true, and you listen to the hiss of moisture escaping from the wood as the fire bites into it, a sound like a whispered secret or a long, slow exhale. The iron pot you lift from its hook is heavy and black, with the soot of countless fires, and you fill it with water from the wooden bucket that sits by the door. Water you drew from the village well yesterday afternoon when the sun was low and the shadows stretched long across the lane. The water tastes of iron and deep earth, and the cold stones that line the well shaft going down and down into the dark, where the water seeps from the ground in a slow, constant seep that has never stopped in all the years anyone can remember. You hang the pot on its hook again and swing it over the flame, and then you stand and wrap your hands around a clay cup of warm broth left from last night's supper, a broth made from the bones of a rabbit that Thomas found dead at the edge of the common, a rabbit that had died of cold or age and not of sickness, and you had boiled the bones with dried peas and a leek from the garden until the water turned brown and rich and filled the cottage with a smell that made the children press close to the hearth despite the warmth of the evening. The cup is rough against your palms and the warmth travels up through your hands and into your wrists and arms, and you watch the steam rise from the surface of the broth and disappear into the dark rafters where bundles of dried herbs hang from lengths of twine, rosemary and thyme and sage that you cut in the summer and tied and hung to dry for the winter months, when fresh herbs are only a memory and the food needs something green to remind the tongue of summer. The children will wake soon, but not yet, and in this narrow window of solitude you are not a widow or a mother or a woman who must draw water and mend stockings and walk to the common and back and sweep the floor and stir the pot and bank the fire. You are simply a person standing in a dark cottage, watching steam rise from a cup and feeling the warmth spread through your hands, while the fire grows brighter and the first birds begin to stir in the hedgerows. Your body remembers this stillness and remembers the years when your husband stood beside you in the mornings, his shoulder touching yours, as you both faced the hearth and waited for the water to boil and the children to wake. His presence a solid warmth on your left side that you did not think about any more than you thought about the stones under your feet or the roof over your head. But the memory is soft and distant now, like a mark on old wood, worn smooth by years of handling, a mark that once meant something and now is just a variation in the grain. noticeable only if you stop and look and run your finger over the surface and think about what made it. The light changes from black to deep blue outside the single window, and you see the outline of the hawthorn tree at the edge of the garden appear as a darker shape against the dark sky, its bare branches like cracks in the fabric of the night. You hear the first bird call from somewhere beyond the garden wall, a robin whose voice is clear and high and seems to ask a question that no one answers. A question about the coming of the day and the presence of the cat that lives in the miller's barn and the likelihood of finding worms in the soft earth near the midden. The robin calls again, and another bird answers from further away, a blackbird this time with a lower, richer call that sounds like water running over smooth stones, and then a third bird joins, and a fourth, and soon the whole hedgerow is alive with the sound of birds waking and calling to each other and establishing the boundaries of their small territories among the hawthorn and the elder, and the bramble that grows thick along the lane. You finish the broth and set the cup on the table and move to the ladder that leads to the loft, and you listen for any sound of the children stirring, but there is only the steady rhythm of their breathing unchanged since you first woke and stood in the dark. Anne will be the first to wake, your eldest girl of 11 years, whose face in sleep still holds the round softness of babyhood. Though her hands have grown long and capable, and she can spin wool into thread almost as fine as your own mother could, she will climb down the ladder with her hair tangled from sleep, and her woolen kirtle pulled on crooked, and her eyes still heavy, and she will move to the hearth without being told and begin setting out the wooden bowls. 3 for the children and 1 for you, each with its own pattern of knife marks and dark stains from years of barley pottage and rabbit broth, and the occasional thin soup of wild greens gathered from the ages of the fields. Thomas will come down next, your boy of 7 years who walks to the common each day to watch the village sheep with the other shepherd boys. A child who has grown quiet in the years since his father died, and now speaks only when there is something that must be said, and not simply to fill the silence. He will sit on the bench and stare at the fire without speaking, a habit he has had since the winter after the burial, when the ground was too frozen to dig, and the vicar said words over a mound of earth that covered nothing, and the real grave was dug weeks later when the thaw came. And then little Mary will call down from the loft that she cannot find her other shoe. A call you answer with the same patient words you use every morning, telling her to feel along the edge of the straw mattress where it always slips during the night and where it will be waiting for her, just as it was yesterday and the day before, and all the days stretching back to when she first learned to put on her own shoes. You climb the ladder now, not to wake them, but to gather the clothes that need mending, and the blankets that need airing, and the small collection of smooth stones that Mary has hidden under her mattress, stones she finds on her walks to the stream and brings home and arranges in patterns that only she understands. The loft is warmer than the main room because the heat from the fire rises through the gaps in the floorboards and collects under the thatch, and you can feel the difference as your head and shoulders emerge into the low space where the children sleep in 3 separate mounds under 3 separate blankets on 3 straw mattresses laid directly on the boards. You move carefully so the boards do not creak, and you gather the things you came for, and you look at each child in turn, their faces peaceful and soft in the dim light that filters up from the hearth below, their breathing slow and regular and completely trusting that the world they will wake to will be the same world they left when they closed their eyes. Anne's hand is curled near her cheek and her thumb rests against her lower lip, in a gesture she has made since she was an infant, nursing at your breast, in the first weeks after her birth, when the world was new, and everything smelled of milk and wool, and the particular sweetness of a newborn's head. Thomas sleeps on his back with his arms at his sides and his face turned slightly toward the wall, a serious sleeper who rarely moves in the night, and wakes in exactly the same position in which he fell asleep, as if his body has decided that sleep is a task to be performed correctly, and without unnecessary motion. Little Mary has kicked her blanket into a twisted rope at the foot of her mattress, and her small bare feet stick out into the cold air, pink and perfect, with the toes slightly curled, and you pull the blanket up and tuck it around her, and she sighs once and settles deeper into the straw without waking. You descend the ladder with the bundle of mending under your arm and the stones in your apron pocket, and you return to the hearth where the water in the pot has begun to move with the first small bubbles that cling to the iron sides before rising to the surface and breaking with a soft sound like the pop of a seed pod opening in the sun. The fire needs another log, and you choose a piece of elm from the pile, a wood that burns slowly with a steady heat and pops less than beech and sends fewer sparks onto the hearthstones where they might catch in a child's dress or in the dried rushes scattered on the floor. You place the log carefully on the fire and watch the flames adjust to the new fuel, licking up around the sides and finding the rough bark and settling into the slow consumption that will last through the morning and into the early afternoon. The cottage is still dim, but the quality of the darkness has changed from the deep black of night to the softer grey of early dawn, and you can now see the details of the room that were hidden when you first woke. The 3 wooden stools around the table, each with its own particular wobble, that you have learned to compensate for when you sit. The shelf on the wall holding the clay cups and the wooden plates, and the salt box carved with a pattern of leaves, that your husband made in the first year of your marriage, when everything was new and many may have a chaos saving. You can see the broom leaning in the corner by the door, a bundle of birch twigs tied to a long handle of ash wood, the twigs worn down on one side from the particular angle at which you sweep, a habit so ingrained you could not sweep differently if you tried. You can see your reflection dimly in the small piece of polished metal that hangs on the wall near the door, a reflection that shows a woman of 34 years, with lines of the corners of her eyes from squinting into the sun and from the smoke of 1,000 fires and from the simple passage of time that marks every face eventually. The water in the pot has come to a proper boil now, and you add a handful of crushed barley from the crock on the shelf, the grains falling into the bubbling water with a sound like rain on a still pond, and you stir with the long wooden spoon that has a handle darkened from years of gripping and a bowl end warm thin from scraping against the bottom of the pot. The barley will cook slowly, and you will add more water as the morning goes on, and by midday it will have become a thick porridge that will fill the children's bellies and send them out into the day with something warm inside them. You hear the loft ladder creak under small feet, and you know that Anne is awake and coming down, and the day has truly begun now. The quiet window of solitude closing gently like a door swinging shut on well-oiled hinges, and you turn from the hearth to greet your daughter with the same words you use every morning, because the repetition is not a lack of imagination, but a kind of comfort, a reassurance that some things remain the same, even when so much has changed. The loft ladder creaks under small feet before you see anyone, a sound that has woken you more times than you can count over the past 3 years, since the fever took your husband in the wet spring of 1674, when the ground was soft and the grave filled with water before they could lower the wooden box. The sound is particular and known to you the way every sound in this cottage is known, the 5th rung from the bottom always creaking louder than the others, because the wood is thin there from a knot that your husband meant to replace but never did, and the feet that descend are light and careful and belong to your eldest daughter, Anne. She appears at the bottom of the ladder with her hair tangled from sleep in a thick brown rope that hangs over one shoulder, her woolen kirtle pulled on crooked so the seam runs down the side of her arm instead of under it, her face still soft and puffy in the way of children who have slept deeply and have not yet returned fully to the waking world. She moves to the hearth without being told, her bare feet silent on the packed earth floor, and she reaches for the stack of wooden bowls that sit on the low shelf beside the chimney stones. There are 4 bowls, and she sets them out in a row on the rough table, 3 for the children and 1 for years one visited with them for years would notice, the first bowl having a deep knife mark across its bottom where your husband once cut into it while carving a piece of meat. The second bowl stained dark on one side from sitting too close to the fire one evening when Thomas fell asleep before finishing his supper. The third bowl with a small chip in its rope and its troth, the trothist, will treat aids so that the trothist did at the calf the tours at for the general behies. Anne sets the bowls in their proper order without thinking about it, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her eyes still blink slowly and her mouth opens in a long, soft yawn that she covers with the back of her wrist. You watch her from your place by the hearth, and you see in her face the same expression her father wore in the mornings, a kind of patient acceptance of the day's beginning, combined with a reluctance to let go of the last threads of sleep, an expression that tugs at something in your chest, and then releases it just as quickly, because there is no time in the morning to stand and feel things that cannot be changed. The loft ladder creaks again, and this time the feet are heavier and slower, and you hear a small cough before you see the face of your son Thomas, age 7, descending into the dim light of the main room. He comes down the ladder one rung at a time with both hands gripping the side and his eyes fixed on his own feet as if he does not quite trust them to find the next hold, a caution that appeared in him after his father died and has not left since. He wears his wool coat over his sleep shirt because the loft is cold in the mornings, and he has learned to dress himself in the dark without waking anyone, a skill born of necessity and a child's desire to be helpful in ways that do not require words. He reaches the floor and crosses to the bench that sits against the wall near the hearth, and he sits down heavily with his hands in his lap and his shoulders slightly hunched, and he stares at the fire without speaking. This is a habit he has had since the winter after the burial, sitting and staring at flames, or at the wall, or at the dirt floor, or at anything that does not require him to talk, or answer questions or explain how he is feeling. The village women whisper that the boy has been touched by melancholy, and that he needs more prayer and less solitude. But you know that he is simply a child who watched his father grow hot and then cold, and then still in the space of 3 days. A child who heard the sound of the fever in his father's breathing, and the sound of his mother weeping in the night when she thought the children were asleep. And you know that some silences are not empty, but full of things too large for a child's voice to carry. You let him sit and stare at the fire, and you do not ask him to speak, or to help, or to be anything other than what he is in this moment. A boy of 7 years in a wool coat that is too large for him because it was his father's coat cut down and re-sewn by your own hands in the weeks after the funeral when you needed something to do with your hands that was not weeping. The third voice comes not from the ladder, but from the loft above, a high, thin call that cuts through the quiet of the morning like a small bird, announcing its presence to a world that may or may not be listening. It is little Mary, age 4 years, calling down that she cannot find her other shoe, a call you have heard every morning for the past 6 months, since she learned to dress herself and discovered that shoes have a way of disappearing into the straw of her mattress during the night. You answer with the same patient words you use every morning, words that have become a kind of ritual between you and your youngest child, telling her to feel along the edge of the mattress where it meets the wooden boards of the loft floor, because that is where the shoe always slips during the night when she kicks her feet in her dreams. You hear her small hands patting and searching, and then a soft sound of satisfaction as her fingers find the missing shoe wedged between the mattress and the wall, exactly where it always is. And then you hear her feet on the ladder rungs coming down more quickly than her brother, but less certainly than her sister. A small thump and pause as she navigates the descent with one shoe on and one shoe clutched in her hand. She reaches the bottom and sits down immediately on the floor to pull the second shoe onto her foot, her face serious and focused on the task of working the leather over her heel, and then tying the laces in a knot that is more enthusiasm than skill. A knot that she will have to retie before she goes outside, but that she made herself and is therefore proud of in the way that 4-year-olds are proud of any accomplishment that marks them as separate from the babies who cannot dress themselves at all. The children are all in the main room now, and you pour the warmed broth from the iron pot into the 4 wooden bowls, the liquid dark and steaming and carrying the smell of rabbit and leek, and the faint mineral taste of the well water that you drew yesterday afternoon. You break yesterday's rye bread into pieces and drop them into each bowl, watching the dark liquid soften the hard crust and turn the bread from something tough and dry into something tender and warm that will fill their bellies and send them out into the cold morning with something solid inside them. The bread is dense and dark and slightly sour from the rye flour that the miller ground 3 weeks ago, flour that you store in a wooden crock with a tight lid to keep out the mice, and the damp flour that will have to last until the next harvest, when the price may be higher or lower depending on the weather, and the whims of the men who own the land, and the men who own the men who own the men who own the nen, who own the men who own the nen, who the nen who own the mill, and the men who own the ships that bring grain from across the narrow sea. When the local harvest fails, you do not think about these things in the morning, you think only about the bowls and the bread and the children's faces in the firelight as they sit down at the rough table and wait for the meal to begin. Anne says the simple prayer her father taught her when she was old enough to speak in sentences, a prayer that asks for blessing on the food and the hands that prepared it, and the home that shelters them, and the memory of those who have gone before. The words in her mouth are slightly different from the words in his memory, because she is 11 years old and her voice is changing, and she has added small pauses and inflections that are her own, a softness on certain syllables and a quickening on others that make the prayer sound like a song she is composing rather than a text she is reciting. You close your eyes while she prays, not because the prayer requires closed eyes, but because it is easier to listen to her voice when you are not also watching her face. Easier to hear the echo of her father in the rhythm of her words without the distraction of her features, which are growing more like your own mother's every year. The prayer ends and you open your eyes and the children pick up their wooden spoons and the morning meal passes in quiet chewing sounds and the scrape of wood against wood and the occasional soft slurp when someone takes in a mouthful of broth that is still too hot. Thomas eats with his head down and his spoon moving in a slow, steady rhythm that does not vary, scooping and lifting and sipping and returning to the bowl for the next scoop, a mechanical process that requires no thought and allows his mind to be somewhere else entirely, perhaps in the common field with the sheep, or in the loft with his dreams, or in some other place that only he knows. Anne eats more quickly but still carefully, her spoon moving in smaller scoops that she blows on before lifting to her lips, a habit she learned after burning her tongue on hot pottage when she was 5 years old and crying for an hour while you held her and wished you could take the pain into your own mouth instead. Little Mary eats with the enthusiasm of a child who has not yet learned that food can be scarce, her spoon splashing in the broth, and her face bright with the simple pleasure of warmth and flavor, and the comfort of a full belly. You eat your own portion slowly, more slowly than the children because you have learned over the years that eating slowly makes the food seem like more than it is, and that the feeling of fullness comes as much from the time spent eating as from the amount consumed. When the bowls are empty and the last pieces of softened bread have been scraped from the bottom with careful passes of the wooden spoons, you send Anne to fetch water from the barrel outside, because the bucket by the door is nearly empty, and you will need more water for the washing and the cooking and the watering of the garden later in the day. She pulls on her wooden pattens and takes the smaller bucket and steps out into the grey morning light, and you hear the door close behind her, and then the sound of her feet on the packed earth of the yard, and then the creak of the barrel lid being lifted and the splash of water being dipped. You turn to Thomas and help him into his patched wool coat, the same coat that was his father's and that you cut down and re-sewed with stitches that are not as neat as a tailor's would be, but that hold the fabric together and keep the wind from finding its way to his skin. The coat hangs a little long on him still, and the sleeves cover his hands unless he pushes them back, but he will grow into it by next winter, and by the winter after that it may be too small, and he will have to find another coat from somewhere, perhaps from the charitable box of the church, or perhaps from a neighbor whose own boy has outgrown his clothes and has no younger brother to pass them down to. You smooth the collar of the coat, and you do not say anything about his father, or about how the coat still carries the faint smell of the man who wore it first, a smell of wood smoke and sheep, and the particular sweat of a body that worked hard every day, and slept well every night, and woke each morning, ready to work again. Thomas looks up at you with his serious face and his eyes that are the same grey as the sky outside, and he says nothing, but he leans into your hand for just a moment, before stepping back and picking up his shepherd's crook from where it leans against the wall by the door. The crook is a stick of hazelwood that his father cut and peeled smooth over many evenings by this same fire, the bark stripped away in long curling ribbons that little Mary collected and pretended were ribbons for her hair, and that you saved in a small basket for reasons you could not explain even to yourself. The stick is worn smooth where Thomas's hand grips it, and there is a small notch near the top where his father carved a mark to show that the stick belonged to this family and to this boy and to no one else. Little Mary has finished tying her shoes and is now sitting on the floor, arranging her collection of smooth stones into a pattern that looks something like a flower or a star, or perhaps just a pleasing arrangement of shapes and colors that satisfies something in her small mind. You will stay with her while you walk Thomas to the common, carrying her on your hip, or holding her hand, depending on how far she is willing to walk before her legs grow tired, and she asks to be carried. The day's beginning in earnest now, and the cottage behind you will wait patiently for your return, the fire burning low and steady, the bowls stacked by the hearth waiting to be washed, the broom leaning in the corner waiting to be lifted, the whole small world of your household suspended in the grey morning light until you come back and set it in motion again. The path from your cottage door to the village common is 347 steps, a distance you walk so many times that it lives in your legs rather than your mind, a rhythm of packed earth and grass tufts, and the particular stone near the old oak that always catches the toe of your shoe, no matter how carefully you try to step over it. You have walked this path in every season and every weather, in the thin light of winter mornings when the ground is hard with frost, and your breath hangs in the air like small ghosts, in the wet springs when the mud sucks at your feet and you must step from stone to stone like a child playing a game, in the heavy heat of summer when the dust rises in small clouds around your ankles, and in autumn, like today, when the earth is soft but not wet, and the fallen leaves make a sound like gentle paper under your wooden pattens. Thomas walks slightly ahead of you with his shepherd's crook over his shoulder, the hazel stick that his father peeled smooth by the fire in the evenings of their last winter together. A winter that was mild and wet, and full of the cough that eventually became the fever that took him in the spring. The boy's stride is shorter than yours, but he moves with a purpose that makes him seem to cover more ground than his legs should allow, his patched wool coat swinging around his thin frame, and his eyes fixed on the path ahead, where the lane curves around the miller's fence and disappears between the hedgerows that mark the boundary of the common land. The morning air in late September carries the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from other cottages, and the faint sharp scent of the first frost that has not yet come, but is waiting somewhere in the grey sky above the clouds. You can hear the distant bleating of sheep already gathered at the fold where the village shepherd waits with his dog, a sound that rises and falls in waves as the flock moves restlessly in its enclosure. And beneath that sound you can hear the smaller sounds of the morning world waking up around you, the rustle of a hedgehog settling into its daytime sleep beneath a pile of dry grass, the call of a crow from the top of the old oak where it sits like a black sentinel, watching the distant ring of the smith's hammer from the other end of the village, where the bidade's work has been at the date. The sky is a flat pale grey with no distinct clouds and no variation in colour from horizon to horizon, just a uniform lid of moisture that softens every sound and makes the world feel smaller and closer and somehow more intimate, as if you and Thomas and the path beneath your feet are the only things that exist in a small bubble of grey light moving slowly through a larger grey world. The hills in the distance that you can see on clear days, the low green hills that roll away toward the west where the river runs, and the next village sits 3 miles distant, are reduced today to faint blue shapes like old bruises on the land, shapes that seem to shift and waver if you look at them too long and that disappear entirely when you look down at the path again. You pass the miller's fence, where brambles grow heavy with blackberries that no one picks because the miller's wife makes a blackberry cordial each autumn, and guards the bushes with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue that has been known to reduce grown men to blushing silence. The berries hang in clusters of deep purple and black, and some are so ripe they have begun to shrivel and fall to the ground, where they lie in small dark piles staining the earth beneath the bushes. You could reach out and pick a handful, and the miller's wife would never know, because she is inside her house at this hour, kneading dough for the day's bread, and singing hymns in a voice that carries through the open window and down the lane, a voice that is surprisingly sweet for a woman known more for her sharp tongue than her kindness. But you do not pick the berries, because it is not your bush and not your cordial, and because you have taught your children that what belongs to another, even if the other is not watching. And Thomas walks past the berries without looking at them, because you have taught him this lesson well, and because he is thinking about the sheep and the common and the long, slow day ahead of him. Thomas stops suddenly in the middle of the path, and you stop behind him without knowing why. And then you see what he has seen. A woolly bear caterpillar crossing the packed earth with its orange and black bands, vivid against the brown mud, moving in that strange rippling wave that caterpillars make. A wave that starts at the back and moves forward, pushing the body along in small increments. The caterpillar is fat and healthy, and its fur is long and soft-looking. And you know without being told that the old people say a woolly bear's bands can predict the severity of the coming winter. A wide orange band meaning a mild winter, a narrow orange band meaning a hard one. This caterpillar's orange band is neither wide nor narrow, but somewhere in between, and you think that perhaps the winter will be neither mild nor hard, but simply ordinary. A winter like all the other winters that have come and gone since you were a child watching woolly bears cross this same path on your way to the common, with your own small crook in your hand. Thomas watches the caterpillar with the complete absorption of a child who has nowhere to be in a hurry and no appointments to keep, and no urgent tasks waiting for his attention. And you wait without speaking because there is no hurry, and because the caterpillar will reach the grass in its own time, and because this moment of watching a small creature cross a path is as important as any other moment in a day, filled with moments. The caterpillar reaches the edge of the grass and disappears into the green blades with a final ripple of its orange and black body. And Thomas straightens up and continues walking as if nothing has happened, and you follow him past the miller's fence and around the bend where the hedgerows grow thick and tangled with hawthorn and elder and the pale green leaves of the honeysuckle that bloomed white and yellow in the summer and now hang heavy with small red berries that the birds will eat when the colder weather comes. The lane opens out onto the common land and you can see the sheepfold in the distance, a rough enclosure of wooden hurdles lashed together with rope and weighted down with stones, where the village flock spends each night, safe from the foxes and the wandering dogs and the other dangers that move through the darkness when honest people are asleep in their cottages. The shepherd is there already, a man of few words whose own wife died in childbirth 8 years past, and who has raised his 2 daughters alone in a small cottage at the edge of the common where the land rises slightly and the ground is too poor for crops, but good enough for a few sheep of his own. He nods once as you approach and you nod back, a greeting that contains everything that needs to be said between 2 people who understand what it means to wake each morning without the person who used to wake beside them. His dog is a black and white collie with 1 blue eye and 1 brown eye, a dog that moves around the edges of the flock in a constant slow circle, not pushing or barking, but simply being present in a way that keeps the sheep calm and together and aware that they are being watched by something that knows more about being a sheep than the sheep know themselves. Thomas takes his place among the other boys who have gathered at the fold. 4 boys between the ages of 6 and 12 who will spend the day moving the flock from one grazing patch to another across the common land. A slow wandering that covers less than a mile in 8 hours because sheep do not hurry, and neither do the boys who watch them. The other boys nod to Thomas, and he nods back, and then they all turn to watch the shepherd open the hurdle gate and let the flock spill out onto the common in a slow wave of wool and bleating and the soft thunder of many small hooves on damp grass. You stand for a moment watching Thomas walk away with the flock, his crook over his shoulder and his too large coat flapping around his thin legs, and you feel the familiar ache in your chest that comes every morning when you leave him here. Ache that is part worry and part pride and part the simple recognition that children grow and move away from their mothers in small increments every day, whether they walk to a common field or to a distant city or simply into the separate world of their own thoughts. The shepherd's dog circles the flock once and then settles into a steady trot beside the shepherd, who walks at the back with his own crook and his own thoughts and his own memories of a wife who will never grow old beside him. The flock moves slowly across the common toward the eastern grazing where the grass is still green and tender from the autumn rains, and the figures of the shepherd and the boys and the sheep grow smaller and smaller until they are just dark shapes against the grey grass and the grey sky, and then they disappear behind a low rise and you are alone on the edge of the common, with the wind in your face and your hands tucked into the opposite sleeves of your woova dress for warmth. You turn back toward the cottage, and the wind is now at your face. A wind that carries the smell of the common and the sheep and the distant smoke of the village chimneys. A wind that makes your eyes water slightly and that you lean into as you walk, your body finding the angle that makes the walking easiest. A slight forward tilt that you learned as a child walking to this same common with the wind in your face and your mother's hand holding yours. The path back seems shorter than the path there, as it always does, because you are not watching Thomas and not thinking about the miller's fence, and not pausing for caterpillars. You are simply walking with the rhythm of 347 steps reversed, the same stones and the same grass tufts and the same curve of the lane appearing in reverse order. You pass the miller's fence again, and this time you do notice the blackberries, but you still do not pick them. And you pass the old oak where the crow still sits on its top branch, watching you with one black eye that seems to contain an ancient and indifferent wisdom. The cottage appears at the end of the lane with smoke rising from its chimney, in a thin grey column that leans slightly to the east with the wind, and you can see Anne in the garden bending over the rows of cabbages and turnips, her small figure moving slowly among the green leaves and the brown earth. Little Mary sits on the doorstep with her collection of stones spread out on the packed earth in front of her, arranging and rearranging them into patterns that only she understands, patterns that shift and change as she picks up one stone and places it in a new position and then picks up another and moves it as well, a slow dance of small grey and white and brown shapes that occupies her completely. You reach the door and you pause for a moment with your hand on the rough wood of the frame, and you look back down the lane toward the common that is now hidden by the hedgerows and the curve of the land, and you think of Thomas walking behind the sheep with his crook and his too large coat and his serious face, and then you step inside the cottage, where the fire has burned low, but not out, and the bowls from breakfast wait to be washed, and the boom leans in its corner, and the whole long day stretches out before you like the grey sky, the smoky. Back at the cottage, Anne has already swept the floor with the bundle of birch twigs tied to a long ash handle, the broom leaving faint scratch marks in the packed earth like writing in a language only the floor understands, marks that will fade over the course of the day as feet move across them and dust settles back into the shallow grooves. The pile of sweepings sits by the door in a small grey mound waiting to be carried out to the midden behind the garden. A mixture of cold ash from the hearth and crumbs of rye bread from breakfast and dried mud that fell from Thomas's boots and strands of wool from the spinning that Anne did yesterday evening, and one small chicken feather that must have drifted in from the yard when someone left the door open too long. The feather is white and soft, and you pick it up and hold it to the light for a moment before adding it back to the pile, thinking of the 3 hens that scratch in the yard and the eggs they lay in the straw of the small coop your husband built against the southern wall of the cottage, where the morning sun warms the wood and keeps the hens content through the cold months. You gather the soiled linens and undergarments into a willow basket that has lived in this cottage longer than you have, a basket woven by someone's hands in a time before your memory begins. The willow withes now darkened with age, and polished smooth by the passage of countless loads of washing and kindling and vegetables from the garden. The weight of the basket is familiar against your hip as you carry it through the door and around the side of the cottage to the small yard where the wooden wash tub sits on its 3 stubby legs, and the rain barrel stands against the wall, catching the water that runs off the thatch during storms. The rain barrel is grey with age, and its wooden staves are held together with iron bands that have rusted to a deep orange brown. And when you lift the lid, the water inside is dark and cold and smells of the oak leaves that fell into it last autumn and have been soaking ever since, releasing their tannins into the water and turning it the color of weak tea. You dip the wooden bucket into the barrel and pour the water into the wash tub, doing this 4 times, until the tub is half full and the surface of the water is still and grey and reflects the pale sky above in a wavering circle that shivers when you set the bucket down beside the tub. The washing is a slow process that cannot be hurried, because hurrying does not make the cloth any cleaner and only tires the arms faster. So you settle into the rhythm of the work with the same patience you bring to all the tasks that fill your days. Each garment is lifted from the basket and dipped into the cold water until it is thoroughly soaked and heavy, and then you rub the fabric against itself in a motion that your hands know without your mind having to direct them. A back and forth movement that works the fibers together and loosens the dirt and the sweat and the small particles of everyday life that have embedded themselves in the weave. For the stubborn stains and the grounding greyness that comes from wearing the same few garments day after day through all the work of a household, you use the ridged washboard that your husband made from a single piece of beechwood in the 2nd year of your marriage, when you complained that the stones by the stream were too rough on your knuckles, and the washing came back with small tears that needed mending. He had taken the beech plank and carved a series of parallel ridges into its surface with his knife, ridges that run in neat lines from top to bottom and catch the cloth as you rub it against the wood, creating a friction that works the soap into the fibers and carries the dirt away in the grey water that drips back into the tub. The soap itself is a lump of grey material that you made last spring from wood ash saved through the winter and mutton fat rendered from a sheep that the village butcher slaughtered in March. a sheep that was old and tough and not worth keeping through another year of thin grazing. The soap smells faintly of sheep and smoke and the particular alkalinity of the lye that leached from the ash when you poured water through it, a smell that is not pleasant but not unpleasant either. Simply the smell of cleanliness as it is understood in a cottage in the 17th century, where cleanliness is a nutters of removing the visible dirt and the strong odours and trusting that the rest will take care of itself. You work the soap into the collar of Thomas's shirt, where the sweat and the dust of the common have left a dark ring that you rub and rub until the fabric lightens and the water around your hands turns a cloudy brown. His other garments follow one by one. The small clothes and the wool stockings with their worn heels that you will need to darn again this evening. The shirt that Anne wore yesterday when she helped you turn the garden soil and got earth ground into the cuffs. The apron that Mary got dirty by sitting in a puddle that she had made herself with water from the bucket and declared was a pond for her stones to swim in. Anne brings little Mary outside and the two of them sit on the flat stone bench that your husband placed against the cottage wall in that same second year of marriage. A bench made from a single slab of local stone that he levered out of the ground in the upper pasture and dragged home on a sledge pulled by the miller's old horse in exchange for a day of your labor, helping the miller's wife with her spring cleaning. The stone is grey and cool even in summer, and it has a natural hollow in its center that catches rainwater and makes a small pool where Mary likes to float leaves and pretend they are boats sailing to distant lands she has heard about in the stories you tell by the fire. She sits now with her collection of smooth pebbles from the stream, the ones she has gathered over many walks to the water's edge, with you or with Anne, pebbles of white quartz and grey granite and brown sandstone, and one special pebble of deep green that she found last month and carries everywhere in her pocket until she loses it and finds it again in the straw of her mattress. She sorts them by size first, lining them up from smallest to largest in a row on the stone bench, and then she scoops them up and sorts them by color, the white ones together and the grey ones together and the brown ones in their own group, and the single green pebble placed carefully at the end like a king surveying his subjects. Anne watches her with the patient attention of an older sister who has long since passed through the age of sorting pebbles, but remembers what it felt like to believe that the arrangement of stones was a matter of great importance. You return to the washtub, and the water has grown darker now, a brownish grey that speaks of the dirt and sweat and smoke and earth that have been lifted from the fabric and suspended in the cold water. You lift each garment out and wring it tightly with both hands, twisting until the water stops dripping and then twisting a little more, and you lay the wet cloth over the branches of the hedge that grows along the boundary of your garden, a hedge of hawthorn and blackthorn, and the occasional elder bush that you keep trimmed so that it forms a thick barrier against the wind and the wandering sheep and the eyes of passers-by. The clean wet clothes hang over the hedge branches in a row, the white linen shifts, and the grey wool stockings and the brown wool kirtles and the pale aprons, and they move slightly in the breeze that comes from the east, a slow, gentle movement like the breathing of people who are sleeping standing up. You pour the dirty water from the washtub onto the roots of the apple tree that grows beside the cottage wall, a tree that your husband's father planted 60 years ago when he first built this cottage and cleared the land and set his young wife to keeping a home in the space he had made. The tree gives small tart apples every other year, and nothing in between, a rhythm that the old people call biennial bearing and that no one can explain but everyone accepts as the nature of certain apple trees. And this is one of the off years when the branches are bare of fruit and the leaves are already turning yellow and brown and falling to the ground, where they will rot into the earth and feed the roots for next year's crop. You take the now empty basket back inside the cottage, and you fetch the mending that has been accumulating in a wooden box near the hearth, a box that your husband made from offcuts of oak that the carpenter gave him in exchange for helping to raise the frame of the carpenter's new workshop. The mending basket contains Thomas's stockings with holes in the heels and toes, Anne's apron with the torn seam where she caught it on the door latch last Tuesday, your own shift with a worn place at the shoulder that will soon become a hole if you do not reinforce it now, and a small pile of loose buttons made of horn and wood, and one of bone that came from a garment you no longer remember, but kept the button because buttons are hard to come by and must be saved against future need. You sit on the bench outside near Anne and Mary, because the light is stronger there, and your eyes are not as sharp as they were when you were 20, and could thread a needle in near darkness by feel alone. The light today is still grey and soft, but it is good light for seeing the small stitches that mending requires. A light that does not glare or cast harsh shadows, but illuminates everything evenly so that you can see the weave of the fabric and the path of the needle and the places where the threads have pulled apart and left a gap that must be closed. You thread the needle with a length of brown wool thread that you spun yourself from the fleece of the same sheep that gave the wool for the stockings you are mending, a sheep that belongs to the village flock and whose wool is distributed among the households according to an ancient agreement that no one wrote down but everyone remembers. The needle is iron and it has darkened with age and used to a deep grey black, and the eye is small and requires you to hold it close to your face and squint slightly as you push the thread through and pull it to an even length. Thomas's stocking is the first to receive your attention. The left stocking with a hole in the heel that has grown from a small thin place to an opening the size of your thumbnail, through which you can see the pale skin of his foot when he wears them. You stretch the stocking over your left hand with the hole centered over your palm, and you begin to weave the needle back and forth across the gap, catching the edges of the hole with each pass and drawing them together in a web of new thread that will hold against the pressure of his foot and the friction of his boot and the long hours of walking behind the sheep on the common. The work is slow and repetitive and requires no thought once the pattern is established, and your hands move through the motions while your mind drifts away to other things. The sound of the wind in the hedge, and the soft murmur of Mary's voice as she explains her pebble arrangements to Anne, and the distant crow of a rooster from somewhere across the village, and the even more distant sound of the smith's hammer, still ringing from the forge at the other end of the lane. Anne has taken out her own small sewing, a sampler that she works on in the afternoons when the other tasks are done. A piece of linen stretched on a wooden frame with a pattern of flowers and leaves drawn onto it in charcoal that she follows with her needle and blue thread. Her stitches are smaller than yours and more even, the work of someone who learned to sew from watching you, and who has young eyes and steady hands and the patience that comes from having no other responsibilities except to learn the skills that will serve her when she has a cottage of her own and children of her own, and a husband who may or may not live to see their children grow. You watch her for a moment as she pulls the needle through the linen and smooths the thread with her thumb, her face serious and focused and so like her father's that you have to look away and back down at the stocking in your hands. The mending continues through the middle of the day while the grey light holds steady and the wet clothes on the hedge drip slowly and begin to lighten in colour as they dry, the white shifts becoming truly white again, and the wool stockings fading from dark wet brown to dry pale brown, and Mary's pebble arrangements shift and change and grow more elaborate until she has used every stone in her collection and sits back to admire her work with the satisfaction of an artist who has completed a masterpiece that only says all the old else. The hole in Thomas's stocking closes under your needle, and you tie off the thread and bite it through with your teeth because you have misplaced your small scissors again and will find them later in some unexpected place, like the pocket of your apron or the windowsill or the shelf where you keep the salt box. You pick up Anne's torn apron next, and you examine the ripped seam where the sleeve meets the body of the garment, a tear that runs for the length of your finger and shows the raw edges of the brown wool fabric. This mending is simpler than the stocking because it is only a seam that has come undone, and not a hole that must be woven closed, and you fold the edges together and begin to sew them back into place with small even stitches that follow the line of the original seam, stitches that will be invisible when the apron is worn, and that will hold until Anne catches the sleeve on something else and tears it again, and you will sit in this same spot on another grey afternoon and sew it closed once more. You prepare the midday meal in the same iron pot you used for breakfast, because there is only one pot large enough to cook for 4 people, and washing it between meals would waste water and time and the heat that still lingers in the iron from the morning fire. The pot hangs from its hook over the flames, and you add more water from the bucket, watching it splash against the dark interior, where the remains of the morning broth have left a thin film of fat and barley that will enrich whatever comes next. From the crock on the shelf, you take a handful of dried peas, small green-grey spheres that rattle like tiny stones when you move them in your palm. Peas that you soaked in water overnight in a small bowl beside the hearth so they would soften and cook more quickly. They fall into the bubbling water with a sound like rain on a still pond, and they sink to the bottom where they will slowly absorb the liquid and swell and become tender and give their flavor to the broth over the next hour. You open the small wooden box where you keep the salt pork, a box that sits on a high shelf away from the mice and the damp and the curious fingers of a 4-year-old who might mistake it for something good to eat raw. The piece of salt pork inside is small and hard and dark, a piece you have been using for nearly 3 weeks now, adding it to the pot each day and removing it before serving so that it flavors the meal without being consumed. A single piece of preserved meat that can last a month or more if you are careful and do not let it boil too long or sit too long in the water between uses. You drop it into the pot and watch it sink among the peas, and you stir once with the long wooden spoon that has a handle darkened from years of gripping and a bowl end worn thin from scraping against the bottom of countless pots. The fire needs another log, and you choose a piece of elm from the pile against the western wall, a wood that burns slowly with a steady heat and pops less than beech and sends fewer sparks onto the hearthstones where they might catch in little Mary's dress or in the dried rushes scattered on the floor. The log is grey and rough with bark that peels away in small strips when you lift it, and you place it carefully on the fire, watching the flames adjust to the new fuel and lick up around the sides and find the dry inner wood and settle into the slow consumption that will last through the afternoon. The cottage fills with the smell of elm smoke, which is sweeter than beech and less sharp than oak, a smell that you associate with the middle of the day and the preparation of the midday meal and the particular quality of light that comes through the single window when the sun is high behind the grey clouds and the whole world is illuminated evenly without shadows. You go out to the garden patch that lies behind the cottage, a rectangle of turned earth bordered by stones that you and your husband gathered from the upper field in the first spring after you were married, when everything was new, and even gathering stones felt like building something that would last. The garden is small, but it produces enough to keep the pot filled through most of the year. Cabbages and turnips and carrots and leeks, and a small patch of herbs that you use for flavor and for medicine, and for the small comforts that herbs provide in a world where comforts are few. The leeks are the last of the summer planting, thin and pale compared to the thick green stalks of July, but still good for the pot, their white roots gripping the dark earth and their green tops waving slightly in the breeze that comes across the garden wall. You kneel in the dirt and pull 3 leeks from the ground, their roots coming up with small clods of soil that you shake off into the bed, and you carry them back inside where you wash them in a small basin of water from the bucket, rubbing the dirt from between their layers with your thumb until the water runs clear and the leeks are clean and ready for the pot. You cut them into pieces with the small iron knife that you keep in a crack between the chimney stones, a knife that your husband sharpened on the whetstone by the door and that still holds an edge because you use it only for vegetables and never for cutting against the hard surface of the table. The leek pieces fall into the bubbling water and the smell of them rises with the steam, a green smell that reminds you of spring, even though it is autumn, and the days are growing shorter and the nights are growing colder, and the world is settling into the long sleep of winter. Little Mary has come inside from the stone bench, and she sits on the floor near the hearth with her collection of pebbles, spread out on the packed earth, arranging them into a new pattern that she explains to you in a running commentary that requires no response. A stream of words about which stone is the mother, and which is the father, and which are the children, and where they are going on their journey across the floor. You listen with half your attention while you stir the pot and watch the peas begin to soften, and the leeks begin to wilt, and the water begin to take on a pale green-brown color that will deepen as the afternoon goes on. The salt pork bobs to the surface and then sinks again, and you push it back under with the spoon because it flavors the broth best when it stays submerged and the salt has time to leach out into the water and into the peas and into the leeks and into the very air of the cottage that your children will breathe while they eat. The open doorway darkens and you look up to see your neighbor Goodwife Fletcher standing on the threshold with a small round cheese wrapped in a clean cloth, her face pink from the walk and her breathing slightly quick because the lane from her cottage to yours rises gently all the way, and she is a woman of 50 years who has borne 7 children and buried 3 of them and carries the weight of those years in her chest when she walks uphill. She does not knock, because neighbors do not knock in this village. They simply appear in doorways and announce themselves with their presence, and you wave her inside with a motion of your hand that is also your greeting and your welcome, and your acknowledgement that you have seen the cheese and understand that she has brought you a gift. Goodwife Fletcher steps over the threshold and sits on the bench by the wall, with the ease of someone who has sat on this bench many times before. In the years when your husband was alive and in the years since he died, in times of celebration and times of sickness and times of ordinary days like this one, when nothing particular is happening except the slow turning of the world and the cooking of the midday meal. She holds out the cheese and you take it and feel its weight in your hands. A small round of fresh cheese wrapped in a cloth that is damp from the whey that is still seeping out of it, and you know without being told that her cow gave more milk than usual this week, and the cheese would spoil before her small household could eat it, and so she has brought it to you, because that is what neighbors do in a village where everyone has too little, and everyone has too little, and the sharing itself is a kind of currency that holds the community together. The herd sees were dull-eyed. You thank her with words that are simple and sincere, and you set the cheese on the shelf beside the salt box, where it will stay cool and where you will remember to use it in the next day or two before it hardens and becomes the kind of cheese that must be grated rather than sliced. Goodwife Fletcher settles herself on the bench, and her talk begins slowly, the way water begins to seep from a spring. First a few drops, and then a trickle, and then a steady flow that fills whatever container is placed beneath it. She talks about the price of wool, which has fallen slightly since last month, because the merchant from the town said the markets in the east are uncertain, and the ships that carry the fleeces across the narrow sea are delayed by weather, or by politics, or by some combination of both, that no one in the village fully understands. She talks about the health of the vicar's wife, who has been suffering from a cough that will not leave her chest, and who has tried a syrup of honey and vinegar and a poultice of mustard on her feet and a tea made from the bark of the willow tree. All remedies suggested by various women in the village who have their own cures and their own theories about the source of the cough and the best way to drive it out. She talks about the strange colour of the sky last Thursday evening, a greenish grey that made everyone feel uneasy, though nothing came of it. A colour that the old people said reminded them of the sky before the great storm of '62, when the wind took the roof off the church and scattered the thatch across 3 fields, and the vicar had to say the Sunday service in the rain, while the congregation huddled under cloaks and prayed for the storm to pass. You listen and nod and stir the pot, and her voice fills the cottage with the comfortable sound of a neighbour talking about nothing in particular. The small news of a small village where the events of the wider world arrive slowly and in fragments, and are interpreted through the lens of local experience and local concern. You offer her a cup of weak ale from the jug that sits on the floor in the coolest corner of the cottage, ale that you brewed last month, from barley malt and water, and a handful of hops that you traded for with the woman who lives at the edge of the village and keeps a small hop garden behind her cottage. The ale is weak because you use the same malt 3 times, a practice that stretches the grain but produces a drink that is more water than ale, and tastes faintly of the barrel and the earth, and the long slow fermentation in the cool dark corner. Goodwife Fletcher refuses twice as the custom requires, saying that she does not want to take your ale, and that she should be going soon, and that her own cottage needs her attention, and you offer a 3rd time with the same words you used the first 2 times, and she accepts with a small nod and a slight smile that acknowledges the ritual and her place within it. You pour the ale into a clay cup and hand it to her, and she drinks slowly, her eyes moving around the cottage and taking in the small changes that have occurred since her last visit. The new arrangement of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the mended stocking that you set aside when she arrived, the pile of Mary's pebbles on the floor, and the child herself who has grown half an inch since Goodwife Fletcher last saw her, and who now stands a neighbour and shows her the green pebble, the special one, the one that she carries a certain Goodwife Fletcher last saw, and who now would stand hatchwood without a hit. The conversation continues in its slow circular way, moving from the price of wool to the health of the vicar's wife, to the strange sky, to the quality of this year's apple crop, which was poor everywhere except in the orchard, behind the manor house where the trees are sheltered from the east wind, and the apples grew large and sweet and are now being pressed into cider that will be drunk by the family who owns the land and their guests, and never by the people who live in cottages like yours and Goodwife Fletcher's, like yours and Goodwife Fletcher's. You listen, and you do not speak much because there is nothing you need to say. The talk is its own purpose and does not require your contribution except for the occasional nod or the small sounds of agreement that keep the flow moving. The pot bubbles on the fire and the smell of leeks and peas and the faint saltiness of the pork fills the cottage, and Goodwife Fletcher finishes her ale and sets the cup on the table and rises to leave with the same slow deliberation with which she arrived. She stands in the doorway for a moment looking out at the grey sky and the hedge where your washing still hangs, drying in the breeze. And she says something about the weather holding and the hope that the rain will stay away until the washing is dry, and then she steps out and walks down the lane toward her own cottage with her hands tucked into her sleeves and her head slightly bowed against the wind. You watch her go until she disappears around the bend, where the hedgerows grow thick and the lane turns toward the common. And then you turn back to the fire and the pot and the children, who will soon be hungry for their midday meal. The cottage feels quieter now than it did before Goodwife Fletcher arrived. A deeper quiet that settles into the corners and stays there. The kind of quiet that follows a visit and makes you aware of how much sound a single voice can fill and how much space that sound leaves behind when it is gone. You stir the pot one more time and taste the broth with the tip of the wooden spoon, and it is good, the peas soft and beginning to break apart, the leeks translucent and tender, the water transformed into something that will warm your children's bellies and send them back out into the afternoon with the strength to finish their small tasks. You remove the piece of salt pork with the spoon and set it on a wooden plate to cool. And you will return it to its box when it is dry and use it again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, until it is nothing but a thin strip of salt and fibre, and you will have to trade for a new piece at the market or from a neighbour who has slaughtered a pig. If redompen med de tinnies, the sen anything mais for the mort and the shenful for chins, that he called Mary in from the garden where she has been pulling the last of the weeds from between the cabbage rows, and the three of you sit at the rough table with the fourth bowl, waiting for Thomas, who will not return for tone evening, but whose place is kept for him anyway, because that is what you do in a family, the great crane sale, and you ain't to think of thing but see she knew came that then seft them. The afternoon stretches out in front of you like a long grey road with no turns, a stretch of hours that must be filled with the small necessary actions that keep a household from falling into the slow disorder of things left undone, and tasks postponed and corners where dust and neglect accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a pond. The midday meal is finished, and the bowls are stacked beside the hearth waiting to be washed with the water you will fetch from the well, and the fire has burned down to a bed of red coals that glow softly under a layer of grey ash and will hold their heat through the afternoon without needing another log until it is time to prepare the evening pottage. Anne sits on the doorstep with her sampler frame balanced on her knees, the linen stretched tight across the wooden rectangle, and the pattern of flowers and leaves drawn in charcoal guiding her needle as she works the blue thread through the fabric in small precise crosses that will one day form a border around a verse from Proverbs that she has not yet begun to stitch. Little Mary lies on her stomach on the floor near the hearth with her pebbles spread around her in a wide circle, and she has fallen asleep with her cheek pressed against the packed earth and one hand still curled around the green pebble, the special one, her breathing slow and even and her small body completely relaxed in the way that only young children can sleep, as if the floor itself is the softest mattress and the middle of the day is the most natural time for rest. You take the wooden bucket from its place by the door, a bucket made of oak staves held together with iron bands and fitted with a rope handle that has been spliced and respliced 3 times since you came to this cottage as a bride. The rope now a mixture of old hemp and newer hemp, and a section of braided wool that you added last winter when the original rope finally wore through at the point where it rubs against the iron ring. The bucket is empty and light in your hand, and you step out into the grey afternoon where the light has not changed since morning except to grow perhaps a shade dimmer, a subtle shift toward evening that is more a feeling than a visible change, a sense that the day has passed its midpoint and is now sliding slowly toward the darkness that will gather in a few more hours. The lane from your cottage to the village well is 182 steps in the opposite direction from the common, a path you walk several times each week, and sometimes several times each day in the hot months when the garden needs more water and the washing seems endless and the children drink more than usual, because the heat makes them thirsty in a way that the cold never does. You pass the smithy first, a low building made of stone and timber, with a roof of heavy slate that does not catch fire from the sparks that fly from the forge. and you hear the ring of hammer on iron before you see the smith himself. A sound that comes in irregular bursts with long pauses between when he is heating the metal or examining his work or simply resting his arm, because the work of a smith is heavy and constant and wears down the body in ways that are visible in the curve of his shoulders and the thickness of his right arm. Compared to the smell of hot metal and coal smoke mixes with the ever-present smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness of the elm smoke from your own chimney, and you nod to the smith as you pass his open door, a nod that he returns without stopping his work, because you have known each other for 15 years and have exchanged perhaps 100 words in all that time, and none of them were necessary beyond the simple acknowledgement that you share a village and a life, and the long slow passage of days that are monthly the same from one year to the next. Beyond the smithy the lane narrows and passes between two stone walls that mark the boundary of the pasture where the village cows are kept in the summer months. Though now in late September the cows have been moved to the lower meadow where the grass is still green and the ground is less churned by their hooves, and the pasture is empty except for a single crow that stands in the middle of the field looking at something in the grass that only it can see. The stones of the walls are covered in moss of the brightest green, a green that seems almost unnatural against the grey of the sky and the brown of the dying grass. And among the moss there are patches of pale lichen that spread in circular patterns like maps of countries that do not exist and never have. You run your hand along the top of the wall as you walk, feeling the rough texture of the stones and the soft wet cushion of the moss and the occasional sharp edge where a stone has cracked and left a surface that could cut if you were not careful. The well is visible now at the end of the lane, where the path widens into a small open space that serves as the village's central gathering point on days when there is news to share, or a peddler passing through, or simply the need to stand and talk with neighbours about the weather and the crops and the small events that make up the whole of village life. The well itself is ancient, older than anyone in the village can remember, older than the oldest stories that the oldest people tell about the oldest people they remember. Its stones are grey and massive and fitted together without mortar in a way that suggests they were placed by hands that knew a different way of building, a way that has been lost in the generations since, but that still holds the stones in place against the pressure of the earth and the weight of the water and the slow pull of time that eventually brings everything down. The stones are covered in the same green moss and pale lichen as the walls along the lane, and there are ferns growing from the cracks between them. Small, delicate ferns that uncurl in the spring and brown and wither in the autumn, and somehow survive the winter to uncurl again when the warmth returns. You set the bucket on the stone edge of the well, and you take hold of the windlass handle, a length of oak worn smooth by countless hands over countless years, the wood polished to a dark sheen that feels almost soft against your palms. The rope that hangs from the windlass is thick and made of hemp, and it disappears down into the darkness of the well shaft, and attached to its end is the well bucket, a smaller vessel made of oak like your own bucket, but older and darker and heavy with the water that has soaked into its fibers over decades of descents and ascents. You begin to turn the handle and the windlass creaks in a particular way, a sound that starts low and rises to a squeak and then falls again as the bucket descends, a sound that you have heard so many times it is no longer a sound but a part of the landscape, like the wind in the hedgerows and the call of the crows and the distant bleating of the sheep on the common. The rope unwinds slowly and you feel the weight of the bucket pulling against your hands through the mechanism of the windlass, a weight that grows lighter as the bucket descends because more of the rope is hanging down the shaft and less of it is being supported by the windlass. A principle that you do not understand in words but know in your arms and your back, and the way you adjust your stance as the bucket goes deeper. You wait while the bucket fills, listening to the sound that comes up from the darkness below. A glug, glug, glug of water entering the wooden vessel, a sound that grows fainter as the bucket sinks and then stops altogether when it is full and heavy, with the cold water that seeps from the earth at the bottom of the shaft. The haul back up is the hard part, and you set your feet and take a breath and begin to turn the handle in the opposite direction. And now the weight is real and growing as more of the wet rope emerges from the shaft and adds its own burden to the bucket full of water below. The windlass creaks in a different way on the way up, a lower sound that speaks of strain and effort and the long, slow work of lifting something heavy from a deep place. And you turn the handle steadily without hurrying, because hurrying only makes the work harder and uses more breath and leaves you tired before the task is done. The rope winds onto the windlass in neat coils, and the creaking continues, and your arms begin to feel the effort in the muscles of your shoulders and your back, and even in your legs that are braced against the stone base of the well. Finally, the bucket appears at the top, rising out of the darkness like something being born from the earth, dripping and cold and full to the brim with water that is so clear it is almost invisible, water that reflects the grey sky above in a small circle of light on its surface. You lift the well bucket onto the stone edge, and you pour the water carefully into your own waiting bucket, doing this slowly so that none of it splashes out and is wasted, because every drop of water you spill is a drop you will have to lift again from the darkness below. You make this trip 3 times because one bucket of water is never enough for cooking and washing and watering the garden and filling the cup that sits by each bed for thirst in the night and the small needs that arise throughout the day that require water in amounts too small to measure, but that add up over the hours to more than a single bucket can hold. The second descent and the same as the first, the same creaking of the windlass and the same glugging from the darkness, and the same weight in your arms and the same careful pouring at the top. And by the third trip, your shoulders are warm with the work, and your breath comes slightly faster, and you are glad that the well is only 182 steps from your cottage, and not 200 or 300 like the wells in some villages where the water is deeper, and the walk is longer, and the women who draw it develop arts and from the. You carry the full bucket back along the lane past the empty pasture and the smithy where the hammer still rings in its irregular rhythm, and the smell of hot metal still hangs in the air, and you hold the bucket in your right hand for the first half of the walk, and then switch to your left hand for the second half, because the weight is enough to tire a single arm, and the switching balances the effort across your body in a way that you learned long ago without anyone teaching you. The bucket bumps gently against your leg with each step, and a small amount of water sloshes out and darkens the packed earth of the lane, leaving a trail of wet spots that will dry in a few minutes and leave no trace that you passed this way except in your own memory of the walk. You reach the cottage and set the bucket by the door, and you stand for a moment looking at the garden and the hedge, where the washing still hangs in the grey light, the clothes now dry or nearly dry and moving slightly in the breeze that has not stopped since morning. Anne is still on the doorstep with her sampler, and she looks up as you approach, and her face is calm and focused, and she has made progress on the border of flowers, a line of blue crosses that now extends halfway around the edge of the linen and will meet itself in another week or two if she works steadily in the afternoons, when the light is good and the other tasks are done. You take a smaller bucket and fill it from the larger one, and you carry it to the garden where the rows of vegetables wait in their ordered lines, the cabbages with their broad leaves spreading to cover the soil, and the turnips with their feathery green tops, and the carrots with their delicate fronds that look like the ferns growing from the well stones, but softer and more tender. You water each plant carefully at its base, pouring slowly so the water soaks into the earth around the roots and does not run off into the paths between the rows where it would be wasted on weeds and bare soil. The water darkens the earth from pale brown to deep brown, and you can almost hear the roots drinking, a sound that is not a sound but a feeling, a sense that the plants are taking in what you give them and turning it into leaves and stems, and the slow swelling of the vegetables beneath the soil. The herb patch is at the end of the garden nearest the cottage wall, where it catches the morning sun and is sheltered from the worst of the wind. And you water the rosemary with its woody stems and needle leaves that smell of the distant south, where rosemary grows wild on hillsides above a sea that is blue and warm, and nothing like the grey channel that lies a day's walk to the south of the village. The thyme spreads low across the ground in a mat of tiny leaves that release their scent when you brush against them, a scent that is sharp and clean and reminds you of the hills where your mother grew up, and where she learned to cook with thyme and rosemary and sage from her own mother, who learned from hers. The sage stands tall with its soft grey-green leaves that feel like velvet when you rub them between your fingers, leaves that you will pick and dry and use through the winter for the pot and for a tea that helps with coughs and sore throats and the general weariness that comes from long months of cold and darkness. The watering takes time because you do not hurry and because each plant deserves its share of the water you carried from the well, and when the smaller bucket is empty, you return to the larger one and fill it again and water the rest of the garden until every plant has received its portion and the soil is dark and damp and smells of earth and growth and the particular sweetness of watered ground. You set the empty bucket by the door and you sit down on the stone bench beside Anne, your back against the warm cottage wall and your hands resting in your lap. And you close your eyes for a moment and feel the grey light on your face and the faint warmth of the sun that is somewhere behind the clouds and the slow tiredness in your arms from the well and the watering. Anne's needle moves in and out of the linen beside you, and the sound is soft and regular. A small whisper of thread through fabric that blends with the rustle of the hedge and the distant hammer from the smithy and the even more distant bleating of the sheep on the common where Thomas walks with his crook and his too large coat and his serious face turned toward the grass and the grey sky. The afternoon continues in this way, a slow accumulation of small moments that do not seem like much when they are happening, but that add up over the hours to a life of drawing water and watering gardens and sitting beside daughters while they sew and listening to the sounds of a village that has been making the same sounds for longer than anyone can remember. Mary wakes from her nap on the floor and comes outside rubbing her eyes with her fists, and she climbs onto the bench beside you and leans against your side, her small body warm from sleep and her hair smelling of wood smoke and wool and the packed earth of the cottage floor. The three of you sit together in the grey afternoon, and no one speaks because there is nothing that needs to be said. The silence is full and comfortable and holds within it all the words that might be spoken and all the feelings that lie beneath the words. And the day moves slowly toward evening while the washing dries on the hedge and the fire holds its heat in the hearth, and the water waits in the bucket by the door for the next task that will require it. The light begins to change in the late afternoon, shifting from pale grey to a warmer grey with hints of gold somewhere behind the clouds, a change so subtle you only notice it when you look up from your work and realize the shadows have grown longer and softer, and the quality of the air has altered in some way that your body recognizes before your mind can name it. You have been sitting on the stone bench with Anne and Mary, while the afternoon passed in its slow, quiet way, and now you rise and stretch your arms above your head and feel the stiffness in your shoulders from the well and the watering and the long hours of sitting on stone that holds the cold of the earth even in summer. The washing on the hedge is dry now, or nearly dry, the white linen shifts and the grey wool stockings and the brown wool kirtles hanging limp and still in the evening air that has lost the briskness of morning and settled into a gentle movement that barely stirs the fabric. You will bring them inside before the damp of night returns, but not yet. There is still time before the darkness comes, and the clothes will benefit from every moment of air and the last faint light that filters through the grey sky. You go inside and put more wood on the fire, choosing 2 pieces of beech from the pile against the western wall because beech burns hot and steady and will bring the pot to a boil more quickly than elm. And you want the evening meal to be ready when Thomas returns from the common with his empty belly and his tired legs, and the particular hunger that comes from walking behind sheep for 8 hours in the grey autumn air. The coals from the afternoon fire are still red beneath their covering of ash, and they catch the new wood quickly, the flames licking up around the dry bark and sending a small shower of sparks toward the chimney, where they rise and fade and disappear into the dark opening above. You set the iron pot on its hook and swing it over the growing flames, and you add water from the bucket that you carried from the well, water that is still cold from the depths of the earth, and that hisses slightly when it touches the warm iron of the pot. The remainder of the midday broth goes in next, a cup or so of brown liquid that has been sitting in a smaller pot on the hearthstones, keeping warm but not cooking, waiting for this moment when it will become the foundation of the evening meal. You add another handful of dried peas from the crock on the shelf, peas that rackle and fall into the water and sink to the bottom where they will soften and swell and give their substance to the pottage over the next hour. From the garden you fetch a carrot that you pulled this morning, a carrot that has grown twisted around a stone and looks like a small orange hand reaching for something, its fingers splayed and crooked, and its body thickened where it had to push against the obstacle in its path. You wash the dirt from its crevices, and you cut it into rounds with the small iron knife, the orange circles falling into the pot one by one, and floating on the surface for a moment before the bubbling water pulls them under. Through the open door, you hear the sound of the flock before you see it. a low, constant bleating that grows louder and then separates into individual voices as the sheep approach the village edge from the common land. The sound is familiar and comforting in its own way, a sound that has marked the end of the day for as long as you have lived in this cottage. First when your husband walked out to meet the flock and helped the shepherd bring them in, and now when your son returns with the other boys and the sheep and the shepherd's dog that circles and guides and keeps the whole slow procession moving in the right direction. You step outside and stand in the doorway with your hand shading your eyes against the grey light that is somehow brighter now than it was an hour ago. A trick of the clouds and the lowering sun that makes the western sky glow faintly behind the uniform grey. The lane curves away toward the common, and you watch the bend where the hedgerows grow thick and tangled, waiting for the first shapes to appear. They come slowly as they always do, the sheep first in a moving carpet of dirty white and brown and black wool, their heads down and their legs moving in that peculiar stiff gait that sheep have, a gait that looks awkward but covers ground steadily and without wasted effort. The shepherd walks at the back with his crook over his shoulder and his dog trotting beside him, and the boys are scattered among the flock, small figures in patched coats and wool caps, their own crooks, smaller versions of the shepherds and their voices occasionally raised in the calls and whistles that keep the sheep moving in the right direction. You look for Thomas among them, and you find him near the front of the flock where he usually walks, a position he has earned over 2 years of showing up every morning and doing what he is told and not complaining about the cold or the rain or the long hours of standing and walking and standing again. His crook is over his shoulder and his 2 large coat flaps around his thin legs, and even from this distance you can see that the hem is muddied and that he walks with a slight limp that means his left boot has rubbed a sore spot on his heel again, a problem that happens every few weeks and that you will tend to tonight with a piece of wool padding and a strip of clean linen. Thomas sees you standing in the doorway and he raises his hand in a small wave, a gesture that he has made every evening since he first started walking to the common 2 years ago, a gesture that says he has returned and that he is safe and that the day is over and the night can begin. You raise your hand in return and you watch as the flock passes the miller's fence and moves along the lane toward the fold, where they will spend the night safe from the foxes and the wandering dogs and the other things that move through the darkness. The shepherd will close the hurdle gate behind them and count them as they enter, a habit born of years of losing sheep to various misfortunes and learning that counting is the only way to know if one is missing, before the morning reveals its absence. The boys will help push the stragglers through the gate, and then they will be released, their work done for the day, their small wages paid in the form of a meal at home, and the knowledge that they are contributing to their families in the only way that children their age can. Thomas appears at the bend in the lane and walks toward the cottage with his crook still over his shoulder and his face tired in the way of a child who has spent 8 hours walking in slow circles behind animals that walk in even slow circles, behind animals that walk in even slower circles. His cheeks are red from the wind, and there is a smudge of dirt across his forehead, where he wiped his face with a dirty hand, and his eyes are heavy with the particular exhaustion of a day spent outdoors in the grey air, doing nothing in particular, but doing it for a very long time. He stops in front of you and reaches into the pocket of his coat and pulls out a small round stone that he holds out on his flat palm like an offering. The stone is grey and smooth, and it has a perfect ring of white quartz running all the way around it like a stripe, a band of milky white that circles the grey stone in a continuous line without beginning or end. You take the stone and hold it to the grey light and turn it in your fingers, and you tell him that it is a fine stone indeed, a stone that deserves a place on the mantel with the others he has brought home over the past 2 years, a collection of 7 stones now, each with some small peculiarity that caught his eye as he walked behind the sheep across the common land. The first was a stone with a hole worn through its center by water and time, a hole that you can look through and see the world on the other side, made small and round. The second was a stone that sparkled with tiny flecks of mica that caught the light when you turned it in the sun. The third was a stone shaped exactly like a heart, a coincidence of erosion and fracture that made everyone who saw it smile. The fourth was a stone of pure white quartz that glowed faintly in the dark if you held it near the fire and let your eyes adjust. The fifth was a stone with the fossil of a small shell embedded in its surface, A shell that lived and died in a sea that covered this land before anyone's memory, before anyone's great-grandparents' memories, before there were people at all to remember anything. The sixth was a stone that was perfectly flat and round and thin like a coin. A stone that Thomas used to skip across the surface of the stream on the one day last summer, when you walked to the water's edge and sat on the bank while he threw stones, and Mary collected pebbles, and Anne waded in the shallows with her skirts tucked up. And now this seventh stone with its ring of white quartz, a stone that will join the others on the mantel where they sit in a row and catch the firelight in the evenings, and remind you that your son is still a child, despite his serious face and his quiet ways and his too large coat that belonged to his father. You set the new stone on the mantel beside the others, and you help Thomas out of his coat, and you see that the mud on the hem is worse than you thought, and will need to be brushed off before it dries and becomes hard and difficult to remove. His boots are muddy too, and you make him take them off outside the door, and he sits on the stone bench and pulls at the leather laces with fingers that are cold and stiff from the long day, and the boots come off with a sucking sound, and you see the hole in his stocking that you mended this morning has already begun to fray again at the edges, the wool too worn to hold the stitches properly against the friction of his foot, and the roughness of the boot's interior. His heel is red and sore where the boot has rubbed, and you make a mental note to find a piece of soft wool to pad the spot before he walks to the common tomorrow, and to darn the stocking again tonight, after the meal when the fire is bright, and your eyes can see the small stitches by its light. You pour warm water from the pot into a small basin, and you set it on the bench beside him, and Thomas washes his hands and face with the same slow thoroughness that he brings to all his tasks, rubbing the dirt from his knuckles, and the smudge from his forehead, and the grey dust of the common from the creases around his eyes. The water turns brown with the dust of the pasture, and the fine grit that blows across the grass when the wind comes from the east. And when he is clean, you hand him a scrap of linen to dry himself, and you pour the dirty water out onto the roots of the apple tree where it will soak into the earth, and join all the other water you have poured there over the years, water from washing and water from cooking and water from the children's baths and water from 1,000 small tasks that have kept this household running since you first came here, as a bride. Anne has come inside and she sets the 4 wooden bowls on the table in their proper order, and Mary abandons her pebbles on the floor and climbs onto her stool with the eagerness of a child who is always hungry at the end of the day, no matter how much she ate at midday. No matter how much she ate at midday. The pottage is ready, the peas soft and beginning to break apart, the carrot rounds tender and orange, the broth a rich brown that smells of leeks and peas and the faint saltiness of the pork that you removed before serving and set aside for tomorrow. You ladle the steaming liquid into the 4 bowls, and you break the remainder of yesterday's rye bread into pieces and drop them into each portion, watching the dark crust soften and absorb the broth and become something that will fill their bellies and warm them from the inside against the chill of the autumn night that is already gathering outside the single window. The 4 of you sit around the rough wooden table as the darkness gathers and the fire casts its flickering light across the room, and across your faces, and across the walls where the shadows move and shift like living things. The meal passes in the companionable silence of people who've been together all their lives and have no need to fill every moment with words. A silence that is broken only by the soft sounds of chewing and swallowing and the scrape of wooden spoons against the bottoms of the bowls. Thomas eats with his head down and his spoon moving in its slow, steady rhythm, and you can see the tiredness in the slope of his shoulders and the way he blinks slowly between bites, as if his eyes want to close, but his hunger keeps them open. Anne eats more quickly, but still carefully, her spoon moving in small scoops that she blows on gently before lifting to her lips, a habit that has become so automatic she no longer notices she is doing it. Mary eats with her usual enthusiasm, and she talks between bites about her day and about her pebbles, and about the green one that is still the special one, and about the beetle she found under a stone in the garden. A beetle that was black and shiny and walked in a straight line until it reached a stem of grass and then turned and walked in another straight line as if it was following a map that only beetles can see. You listen to Mary's chatter and you watch Thomas's tired face and you feel Anne's steady presence beside you, and you eat your own portion slowly because there is no need to hurry and because the warmth of the food and the warmth of the food and the warmth of the fire and the warmth of your children around the table are all the same warmth. a warmth that fills the cottage and pushes back the darkness and the cold and the long night that waits outside. When the bowls are empty, you stack them beside the hearth for washing in the morning, and you bank the fire carefully, pushing the remaining embers together and covering them with a thick layer of ash, so they will survive until you wake and kneel before the hearth, and blow gently on the single orange glow, and begin the day again. The children climb the ladder to the loft one by one, Anne first with her sampler tucked under her arm, then Thomas with his slow, careful steps and his tired body, then Mary, who must be carried up the last few rungs because her legs are short, and her arms are tired and she is already half asleep against your shoulder. You settle them into their straw mattresses and pull the wool blankets up to their chins, and you stand for a moment in the darkness of the loft, listening to their breathing slow and deepen, and settle into the rhythm of sleep. Then you climb down the ladder, missing the 5th rung by habit, and you sit by the banked fire in the quiet cottage, and you listen to the sounds of the night beginning outside, the rustle of the hedge, and the distant call of an owl, and the soft creak of the cottage settling into the earth. And you think about the stone with its ring of white quartz sitting on the mantel with the others, a small collection of small things that mean nothing to anyone but you and your son, and that mean everything for exactly that reason. After the bowls are wiped clean with bread and stacked beside the hearth for washing tomorrow morning, the children settle into their evening places around the fire, positions they have occupied so many nights that the floorboards have worn shallow depressions where they sit, and the hearthstones have absorbed the warmth of their bodies and the weight of their small frames in ways that are invisible but real. The fire has been fed with 2 more logs of beech, and it burns steadily now, the flames yellow and orange, and occasionally blue at the base where the heat is most intense, and the light it casts fills the main room of the cottage and pushes back against the darkness that has gathered outside the single window and against the walls and in the corners where the flickering glow does not quite reach. The room smells of wood smoke and the lingering scent of the evening pottage, and the faint mustiness of wool that has been worn all day and is now warming by the hearth, a smell that is the smell of your family and your home, and the long, slow passage of evenings that have come and gone since you first lit a fire in this hearth, as a young bride who did not yet know how to bank the coals properly, or how to judge the dryness of the wood by its sound when struck. Anne takes up her sampler again, but the light from the fire is too flickering for fine work, the shadows dancing across the linen in ways that make the small holes of the fabric disappear and reappear, and make her needle miss its mark more often than it finds it. She tries for a few minutes, with her face bent close to the frame and her brow furrowed in concentration, and you watch her push the needle through and pull the blue thread taut, and then pause and squint and pick out the stitch with the point of the needle, because it has gone crooked in the uncertain light. After the 3rd such correction, she lets out a small breath that is not quite a sigh, and she puts the sampler aside on the bench and simply watches the flames with her chin resting on her knees and her arms wrapped around her legs. Her face in the firelight is soft and young, and also somehow old, the face of a girl who's becoming a woman in a world where becoming a woman means learning to do the things that women do, and to accept the things that women know, and to accept the things that women accept, and to carry the weight of a household on shoulders that are still narrow and not yet fully grown. You see her profile against the glow, and you see her father in the line of her jaw, and your own mother in the curve of her cheek, and you see something that is only Anne, a particular stillness and patience that has been hers since she was a baby, who would lie in her cradle and watch the shadows on the ceiling for hours, without crying or demanding to be held. Thomas lies on his stomach on the packed earth floor with his head propped on his hands and his elbows splayed out to either side, a position he has taken every evening since he was old enough to choose where to sit and how to arrange his body for the long, slow hours between supper and sleep. His feet are bare now, and you can see the red spot on his left heel where the boot rubbed, a spot that is already beginning to fade as the warmth of the fire and the rest of being still eases the irritation. He stares into the embers at the base of the fire where the wood has burned down to a shifting landscape of red and orange and grey, a miniature world of canyons and peaks and valleys that changes from moment to moment as the embers shift and settle and the ash falls into the gaps. He sees shapes there that he sometimes names aloud in a voice that is soft and distant, and seems to come from somewhere behind his eyes rather than from his mouth. Tonight he sees a dragon first, a dragon with a long neck and a sweeping tail and wings that are folded against its body, and he points with one finger and traces the outline in the air. And you look, and you can see it too, a shape in the embers that could be a dragon if you let your eyes go soft, and your mind go loose and stopped insisting that embers are only embers and nothing more. The dragon shifts and becomes a ship with a high prow and a single mast and a sail that billows in a wind that exists only in the movement of the flames, a ship that might be sailing across a sea that is the same grey as the sky above the common, or across an ocean that none of you have ever seen and that exists only in stories told by travellers and merchants, and the occasional peddler who has been to the coast and seen the water stretch away to the horizon, with no land in sight. The ship breaks apart and reforms into a face that Thomas says looks like old Goodman Croft from the End Cottage, and you look and you can see it too. The heavy brow and the drooping mouth and the particular shape of the chin that Goodman Croft has carried through 70 years of life in this village. A face that is as familiar as the stones of the well and the curve of the lane and the sound of the smith's hammer in the morning. Little Mary climbs into your lap without asking. A habit from babyhood that has not yet faded and that you hope will not fade for a while longer, because the weight of her small body against yours is a comfort that you cannot explain and do not try to. She settles herself with her back against your chest and her head tucked under your chin, and you shift to accommodate her weight and her warmth, and the particular smell of her hair, which is the smell of her hair, which is the smell of wood smoke and wool, and the clean outdoor air of the yard, and the faint sweetness of the rye bread she ate at supper. Her small hands rest on your arms and you can feel her breathing slow and steady, and you know that she will fall asleep soon as she always does during the evening stories. Her body giving in to the warmth and the darkness and the sound of your voice that has been the background music of her entire short life. You wrap your arms around her and you feel the solid reality of her, the bones and the muscles and the beating heart and the small movements she makes as she shifts to find the most comfortable position against you. And you think about how she was not yet walking when her father died, how she will grow up with no memory of him except the stories you tell and the small things he left behind, the salt box carved with leaves and the shepherd's crook of hazelwood, and the way his coat looks on Thomas's thin shoulders. The fire pops, and a small shower of sparks rises toward the chimney, a brief fountain of orange lights that ascend and then fade and disappear into the darkness above, and you wait until they are gone before you begin to speak. The story you tell is one your own mother told you on evenings like this one, when you were small and the fire was the only light, and the world outside was dark and full of sounds that you did not understand, and that your mother's voice pushed back and made harmless. It is a story about a girl who planted a single bean and watched it grow into a stalk that reached the clouds, a bean that was given to her by a traveler in exchange for something small and ordinary. A cup of milk, or a piece of bread, or simply the kindness of a stranger on a cold morning. You tell the story slowly with long pauses between sentences, because the point of an evening story is not the plot, or the suspense, or the clever twists that keep a listener guessing. The point is the sound of your voice filling the quiet room and pushing back the darkness that presses against the single window, the rhythm of words that rise and fall and rise again, like the breathing of someone who is already half asleep. The girl in the story climbs the beanstalk, and she finds a world above the clouds where everything is strange and wonderful and slightly frightening in the way that all new things are frightening. A world where giants live in castles made of stone that is white like the quartz ring around Thomas's new stone. You describe the castle slowly and in great detail because the details are what matter in a sleep story. The color of the stones and the height of the doors and the sound of the giant's footsteps that shake the ground like distant thunder, and you watch the children's faces in the firelight as they listen and see the castle in their own minds and add their own details that you have not spoken. Anne's eyes are half closed, but she is still listening, her chin still resting on her knees and her face soft and peaceful in the way it only is when the day is done, and there are no more tasks to complete and no more responsibilities to carry except the simple responsibility of being still and listening to a story. Thomas has stopped naming shapes in the embers, and he lies with his cheek pressed against his folded arms and his eyes fixed on the fire, but not really seeing it. His mind following the girl up the beanstalk and into the cloud world where anything is possible and nothing is ordinary. Mary's breathing has slowed and deepened, and you can feel her body growing heavier against you as sleep takes hold, her small hands relaxing their grip on your arms, and her head settling more firmly under your chin. You continue the story through the girl's adventures in the giant's castle, the things she sees and the things she takes, and the narrow escapes that are not really narrow, because this is a story for children on a quiet evening, and the girl will always escape, and the giant will always be fooled, and the beanstalk will always fall, and the beanstalk will always fall at the end. The giant in your story is not frightening. Not really. He is large and loud, and he has a deep voice that rumbles like the wind in the chimney. But he is also slow and easily tricked, and more interested in counting his golden coins than in chasing a small girl through his enormous castle. You describe his counting in a slow, rhythmic way, one coin and then another and then another, the sound of gold on gold in the way his thick fingers move over the piles of treasure. And you can see Thomas's eyes begin to blink more slowly and stay closed for longer between each blink. The girl hides in a cupboard and then behind a curtain, and then inside a large brass pot that hangs from a hook in the giant's kitchen, and each hiding place is described in the same slow, careful detail. The smell of the spices in the cupboard, and the dusty velvet of the curtain, and the curved metal walls of the pot that amplify the sound of her own breathing until she is certain the giant will hear her. But the giant does not hear her, because giants in stories never hear the small things. They are too busy with their large concerns and their heavy footsteps and their voices that fill the world and leave no room for the quiet sounds that matter most. The fire has burned down now to a bed of red coals that glow steadily and throw a softer light across the room, a light that is more shadow than illumination, and that makes the walls seem to recede and the ceiling seem to rise and the whole cottage feel larger and the more mysterious than it does in the daylight. You have one more small log, not to build the fire back up, but to keep it alive through the end of the story and into the time when you will bank it for the night, and the new wood catches slowly and sends up small flames that dance and flicker and cast moving shadows on the children's faces. Thomas has fallen asleep on the floor with his cheek pressed against the packed earth and his hands still folded under his head. And you let him lie there because the floor near the fire is warm, and he will wake when you carry him to the loft later. Or he will not wake and you will carry him to the loft later. Or he will not wake and you will carry him anyway. And he will remember nothing in the morning except that he fell asleep by the fire and woke in his bed. Anne is still awake, but barely, her eyes open to slits and her body perfectly still, and you know that she is listening to the end of the story, even if she will not remember it tomorrow. The sound of your voice reaching some part of her that remains alert while the rest of her drifts towards sleep. The girl in the story finds her way home as all girls in all stories eventually do, climbing back down the beanstalk with the giant's treasures clutched in her small hands, and the beanstalk falls behind her because she cuts it with an axe that was left leaning against the garden wall by someone who is never named and whose purpose in the story is only to provide the axe at the right moment. The giant's castle remains above the clouds, and the giant himself remains in his castle counting his coins and grumbling about the small things that have gone missing. And the girl returns to her cottage, where her mother waits with a warm fire and a bowl of pottage and a look on her face that says she knew her daughter would return. Because daughters always return in the stories that mothers tell. The story ends as all stories end, with the girl finding her way home and the beanstalk falling and the world returning to its ordinary shape. And in the silence that follows the last words, you hear the first drops of rain begin to tap against the thatch above. A soft sound that is almost not a sound at all. More a presence than a noise. A gentle tapping that will grow steadier as the night goes on and will be the last thing you hear before you fall asleep. You sit for a while longer with Mary's warm weight against your chest and the fire glowing red and low and the rain beginning to fall more steadily outside. And you watch Anne's eyes finally close and her breathing slow and even out into the rhythm of sleep. Thomas has not moved from his spot on the floor, and you will have to wake him enough to climb the ladder or carry him up yourself. A task that is becoming harder as he grows taller and heavier and less like the small boy who used to fall asleep in your lap, just as Mary does now. The cottage is quiet, except for the rain and the soft crackle of the dying fire and the breathing of your 3 children in their various positions around the hearth, and you feel the familiar ache of the day ending and the night beginning and the knowledge that tomorrow will be the same as today and the day before, and all the days that have come since you first lit a fire in this hearth, you than to waken make home in a world that asks nothing more of you than to waken a home in a world that asks nothing more of you done as it in doen that You shift Mary carefully, and you rise to your feet with her in your arms, her head lolling against your shoulder, and her small hands still relaxed and open. And you carry her to the ladder and climb slowly with one hand on the rungs and the other holding her against you, feeling the fifth rung creak under your foot, and stepping carefully to avoid the sound that might wake her. In the loft, you lay her on her straw mattress and pull the wool blanket up to her chin, and she stirs once and says something that is not quite a word, and then settles back into the deep sleep of a child who has been warm and fed and loved and told a story by the fire. You go back down and you wake Thomas gently with a hand on his shoulder and a soft word, and he rises like someone swimming up from deep water, his eyes unfocused and his body heavy with sleep, and you guide him to the ladder and watch him climb with his slow, careful steps and his hands gripping the sides, and you follow him up and make sure he finds his mattress and his blanket and the particular position on his back that he always sleeps in. Anna's woken on her own, and she climbs the ladder behind you without being told, her sampler tucked under her arm and her eyes already closing again, and she settles into her own mattress and pulls her blanket up and is asleep again before you have finished tucking Mary's blanket around her small feet. You climb down one last time and you stand by the hearth, and you look at the banked coals glowing red beneath their covering of ash, and you listen to the rain on the thatch and the breathing of your children in the loft above, and you think about the story you told and the stories your mother told you, and the stories that will be told by your children to their own children, on evenings like this one in cottages that have not yet been built. Then you climb the ladder for the last time, and you lie down on your own mattress, and you pull the wool blanket to your chin, and you listen to the rain and the breathing and the small sounds of a cottage settling into the night, and somewhere between one breath and the next, you are asleep. The children are in the loft now, settled into their straw mattresses under wool blankets that smell of sheep and lanolin and the particular mustiness of a cottage that has stood for 60 years, through wet winters and dry summers, and the slow accumulation of smoke and breath, and the dust of countless days. You remain by the hearth not because there is work left to do, but because the quiet of the cottage after the children sleep is a different kind of quiet, a deeper quiet that belongs only to you and the fire and the small sounds of a house settling into night. The banked coals glow red beneath their covering of ash, and the room is lit only by that faint crimson light, and the memory of the flames that burned here an hour ago. A light that is more felt than seen, a warmth on your face and your hands that tells you the fire is still alive, even if its brightness has been buried for the night. You sit on the bench by the hearth with your hands folded in your lap and your back against the warm stones of the chimney, and you let the silence of the cottage settle around you like a second blanket, heavy and soft and full of the small sounds that are always present but only heard when everything else is still. The rain has grown steadier since the story ended, and the children climb the ladder to their dreams, a soft, even drumming on the thatch that makes a sound like someone whispering far away, a sound that changes when the wind shifts and the rain strikes the western wall instead of the roof. The thatch is thick and well made, layers of straw packed tight and fastened with hazel switches, a roof that your husband and his father rethatched 7 years ago in a long, dry autumn when the straw was golden and the days were warm and the work of lifting and tying and smoothing went on for 3 weeks, from dawn until the light failed. You remember standing below and handing up bundles of straw and watching the 2 men work with their bare feet braced against the roof beams, their movements synchronized in a way that came from years of working together and from the unspoken understanding that exists between a father and a son who have spent their lives in each other's company. The roof has held through 7 winters since then, and it will hold through 7 more before the straw begins to thin and the rain finds its way through to drip on the floor and remind you that nothing lasts forever and everything must be renewed in its time. The rain shifts again, and now it strikes the thatch at a steeper angle, a sound that is sharper and more insistent, and you listen to the rhythm of it, and you find patterns that are not really patterns, but that your mind shapes into them anyway, because the human mind seeks order even in the random fall of water from a grey sky. A gust of wind comes down the chimney and stirs the ash on the hearth and makes the banked coals glow brighter for a moment, a sudden bloom of orange that fades as quickly as it came, and you smell the rain and the wind, and the wet earth and the cold, clean air of the autumn night. The cottage creaks around you in the way that old buildings creak, not with any urgency or distress, but with the simple settling of wood and stone and thatch that have been expanding and contracting with the changes of temperature and moisture for 60 years and will continue to do so for 60 more if the cottage is cared for and the roof is repaired and the fire is kept burning through the winters. You listen to the breathing of your children in the loft above, a sound that you can hear if you are very still, and the rain pauses for a moment, 3 different rhythms that sometimes align by chance and then drift apart again like boats on a slow river. Anne's breathing is the steadiest, a soft rise and fall that speaks of the deep sleep of a child who has worked all day at the small tasks of a household and who carries no worries that cannot be solved by the morning light. Thomas breathes more slowly, and there is a slight roughness to his breath, the remnant of the cough that he had last winter and that never quite left him, a cough that you listen for every night and that you have learned to distinguish from the other sounds of the cottage, the creak of the rafters and the rustle of the thatch and the distant call of the owl from the churchyard. Mary's breathing is the lightest and quickest, the breath of a small child whose lungs are still growing and whose body burns through sleep with an intensity that you remember from when Anne and Thomas were her age, a sleep so deep that nothing wakes them except the morning light and the sound of your voice calling them down to the hearth. You sit in the darkness, and you listen to these sounds, and you think about nothing in particular, your mind moving slowly from one image to another without any urgency or connection, the way clouds move across a grey sky on a windless day. The well bucket descending into the darkness, the sound of the water filling it far below, the creak of the windlass as you turned the handle and felt the weight grow heavier with each rotation, the grey sky above the common, the flat uniform grey that had no shape and no variation, and that made the hills in the distance look like faint blue bruises on the land, the woolly bear caterpillar crossing the path with its orange and black bands, vivid against the brown mud, its body rippling in that strange wave that moved it forward in small increments toward the grass and the safety of the hedgerow. Thomas's stone, with its ring of white quartz, a perfect circle of milky white that ran all the way around the grey stone without beginning or end, a stone that now sits on the mantel with the others in a row that catches the firelight in the evenings, the taste of the weak ale that you shared with Goodwife Fletcher, ale that was more water than barley, and that tasted faintly of the barrel and the earth and the long, slow fermentation in the cool, dark corner of the cottage. The smell of the elm smoke from the midday fire, sweeter than beech and less sharp than oak, a smell that you associate with the middle of the day and the preparation of the pottage and the particular quality of light that comes through the single window when the sun is high behind the clouds. These images drift through your mind and fade and are replaced by others, and you do not hold on to any of them or try to make them into a story or a memory with meaning. You simply let them come and go, like the rain on the thatch and the wind in the chimney and the small sounds of the cottage settling around you. The fire has burned down further now, and the red glow of the banked coals is fainter, a single point of warmth in the darkness that seems to pulse slightly with the movement of air through the chimney, a heartbeat of light that will last until morning if you have banked it properly. You have banked it properly because you have done this thousands of times, kneeling before the hearth in the darkness and pushing the embers together and covering them with ash and trusting that they will survive until you wake and blow gently on the single orange glow and begin the day again. The skill came from your mother and hers, from her mother, and so on, back into a time before anyone remembered. A chain of women kneeling before hearths in dark cottages and banking the coals against the long night and rising before the grey light to blow the embers back to life. Outside, an owl calls from the churchyard, 3 notes descending, a sound that is lonely and beautiful and that you have heard on countless nights since you first came to this village as a bride, and lay in the loft with your husband beside you, and listened to the same owl calling from the same churchyard and felt the same mixture of comfort and melancholy that you feel now. The owl calls again, and then silence returns, a silence that is deeper than before because the rain has paused and the wind has dropped and the whole world seems to be holding its breath in the darkness. In that silence you can hear the small sounds that are usually hidden, the scratch of a mouse in the wall near the chimney stones, a sound that you have heard so many times it is no longer a disturbance but simply a part of the night, like the breathing of your children and the creak of the rafters. The mouse is searching for something, perhaps the crumbs of rye bread that fell between the floorboards during supper. perhaps simply exploring the passages that it has carved through the walls of the cottage over generations of mice that have lived and died in this same small space. You do not mind the mouse because it does no real harm, and because its presence is a sign that the cottage is warm and dry and full of the small provisions that sustain life, and because the alternative is a cottage so cold and empty that even the mice have abandoned it. The rain returns, softer now, a gentle misting that you can barely hear against the thatch, a sound that is more a presence than a noise, a dampness in the air that you feel on your face and your hands. You rise from the bench slowly because your legs have grown stiff from sitting still in the cooling room, and you stand for a moment in the darkness and you look toward the ladder that leads to the loft where your children sleep. The loft is darker than the main room because the faint glow of the banked coals does not reach up through the gaps in the floorboards, and you can see nothing but the black shape of the ladder and the darker black of the opening above. You cross the room with your bare feet silent on the packed earth, a floor that you have walked across so many times that your feet know every dip and hollow, and the particular place near the door where the ground is slightly uneven, because a stone lies just beneath the surface, a stone that your husband meant to dig out and never did. You find the ladder by touch and you begin to climb, feeling each rung with your bare feet and your hands, knowing the fifth rung from the bottom creaks and stepping carefully to avoid it, a habit so ingrained that you do it without thinking even when there is no one to wake. In the loft, the darkness is complete, and you must rely on your memory of the space and the positions of the 3 mattresses on the floorboards. You know that Anne sleeps against the western wall, where the roof slopes down and the thatch is closest to her face, a spot she chose when she was 7 years old because she liked to hear the rain on the roof and feel the cold air that seeps through the straw on winter nights. Thomas sleeps in the middle with his mattress aligned straight and his blanket tucked precisely around him, a position he has maintained since he was old enough to arrange his own bed. Mary sleeps against the eastern wall, where the roof is higher and there is more room to sit up without bumping her head, a spot that was yours when you first came to this cottage and that you gave to her when she was born because it was the warmest corner of the loft and the safest place for a new baby. You can just make out the shapes of your 3 children under their blankets, darker mounds against the dark background of the roof and the walls, and you stand for a moment in the center of the loft and you listen to their breathing, 3 different rhythms that you have listened to on so many nights that you could identify each child by breath alone. Anne's breathing is slow and deep and perfectly even, the breath of someone who has worked hard and is now completely at rest. Thomas's breath has the slight roughness that you listened for earlier, a roughness that is not worse than it was last night or the night before, a roughness that you have learned to accept as a part of him, like the color of his eyes and the shape of his hands. Mary's breathing is light and quick, and she murmurs something in her sleep, a word or a fragment of a word that you cannot catch, the language of dreams that makes sense only in the world where dreams occur and that evaporates upon waking like mist in the morning sun. You move carefully to your own mattress, which lies near the head of the ladder, a position that allows you to hear if any of the children wake in the night and need you, and you lower yourself onto the straw and pull the wool blanket up to your chin. The straw rustles beneath you as you settle, a sound that is familiar and comforting, the same sound that has accompanied your sleep for 14 years in this cottage, and for 20 years before that in your mother's cottage where you slept in a loft just like this one, with your brothers and sisters, and listened to the same rustle of straw and the same breathing of sleeping children, and the same distant call of an owl from a different churchyard. You lie on your back with your hands folded on your chest, and your eyes open in the darkness, and you listen to the rain on the thatch and the breath of your children and the small sounds of the cottage settling around you. The rain has softened further, and now it is barely a sound at all, more a feeling of moisture in the air and a coolness on your face that tells you the world outside is wet and grey and slowly turning toward winter. The wind has died completely, and the cottage is still, so still that you can hear your own heartbeat if you listen carefully, a slow, steady rhythm that has been with you since before you were born, and that will be with you until the moment when it stops, and the listening stops, and the long quiet of the night becomes permanent. You do not think about that moment because there is no reason to think about it on a night like this, when the children are sleeping, and the rain is falling, and the cottage is warm, and the banked coals are glowing in the hearth below. Your mind drifts again to the images of the day, the 347 steps to the common, and the grey sky, and the woolly bear caterpillar, and the stone with its ring of white quartz, and they pass through your thoughts like the clouds that you cannot see, but that you know are moving across the sky above the thatch. The images fade and are replaced by soft grey blankness, a space where no thoughts occur and no memories surface, a space that is not sleep, but the approach to sleep, the threshold between waking and dreaming, where the mind lets go of the day and the body relaxes into the straw and the blanket and the darkness. Somewhere in the distance the owl calls again, 3 notes descending, and the sound reaches you as if from very far away, a sound that belongs as much to your dreams as to the waking world. You hear it and you do not hear it, your mind already moving into the place where sounds become shapes, and shapes become stories, and stories dissolve into the deep quiet of a night that will last until the grey light touches the single window and you wake and kneel before the hearth and blow gently on the ember and begin the day again. The rain continues to fall on the thatch, soft and steady and endless, and your breathing slows to match the breathing of your children in the loft around you, and the last thing you know before sleep takes you is the warmth of the wool blanket and the smell of wood smoke in your hair, and the sound of the cottage settling into the earth beneath the weight of the night. You wake before the grey light touches the single window, exactly as you woke yesterday, and exactly as you will wake tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, until the children are grown and the cottage is quiet in a different way, and the mornings belong only to you and the fire and the memory of the small feet that used to creak on the loft ladder. The air is cold against your face while the rest of your body stays wrapped in the rough wool blanket that has covered you for 14 winters now, a blanket woven by your own mother on a loom that stood in the corner of a cottage, much like this one in a village 3 days' walk to the north, where the land rises toward the hills and the soil is thinner and the sheep are smaller but hardier. The room around you is silent except for the soft breathing of your 3 children sleeping in the loft above, a sound so faint it blends with the rustle of thatch in the wind outside and the small scratchings of the mouse that lives in the wall near the chimney stones, and that you have heard on so many nights that its presence has become a part of the cottage itself, like the stones and the beams and the smell of wood smoke that never quite leaves the air. The rain has stopped and the world outside is silent in the way that follows a long rain, every surface wet and soft and absorbing sound, so that even the distant crow of the rooster from the farm at the edge of the village seems muffled and far away. You lie still for a moment longer than you usually do, because the warmth of the blanket and the particular comfort of the straw mattress after a night of rain make it hard to leave. But the habit of years is stronger than the comfort of the moment, and you push the blanket back and swing your feet to the cold floorboards of the loft. Your bare feet find the familiar rungs of the ladder, and you descend in the darkness with your hands guiding you and your body, remembering the exact distance between each rung and the way the ladder leans slightly to the left where one of the supports has settled into the earth over the decades. You miss the 5th rung by habit, because it creaks and you have trained yourself to step over it without thinking, a small adjustment that you make every morning and every night, and that has become as automatic as breathing. The main room of the cottage is dark and cold and smells of the banked fire and the faint mustiness of the packed earth floor that has absorbed the moisture of the rainy night and now releases it slowly into the air. You cross to the hearth with your hand outstretched to touch the familiar surfaces that guide you, the edge of the wooden table smooth from 100 years of hands wiping across it, the cool iron of the pot hanging from its hook, the rough stones of the chimney breast still holding a faint memory of yesterday's warmth beneath their cold exterior. You kneel before the hearth where last night's banked coals have held their heat through the long hours of darkness and the rain, and you see the single faint orange glow waiting beneath the white ash, exactly where you left it. A small point of warmth that has survived the night, and now waits for you to wake it and feed it, and coax it back into the flame that will warm the cottage and cook the pottage, and light the faces of your children when they climb down the ladder. You blow gently on the ember, and the orange deepens to red, and a tiny curl of smoke rises from the ash, and you feed it dried moss gathered from the stone wall in late summer when the moss was brittle and grey-green and pulled away in soft sheets that you stored in a clay pot beside the hearth. The moss catches and flames in a small bright burst that warms your face for a moment, and then you add twigs of hazel cut last autumn and stored in a bundle under the eaves where the rain cannot reach them. Twigs no thicker than your smallest finger that snap and pop as the fire takes hold and grows from a flicker to a steady flame. You add a split log of beechwood from the pile against the western wall, and you listen to the hiss of moisture escaping from the wood as the fire bites into it. A sound like a whispered secret, or a long, slow exhale. The same sound you heard yesterday morning, and the morning before, and all the morning stretching back to the first time you lit a fire in this hearth, as a young bride who did not yet know how to bank the coals properly, or how to judge the dryness of the wood by its sound, when struck. The iron pot you lift from its hook is heavy and black with the soot of countless fires, and you fill it with water from the wooden bucket by the door. Water you drew from the village well yesterday afternoon, when the light was grey and the wind was from the east, and the bucket felt heavier on the return walk, because your arms were tired from the washing and the mending and the small tasks of the day. The water tastes of iron and deep earth, and the cold stones that line the well shaft going down and down into the dark, where the water seeps from the ground in a slow, constant seep that has never stopped in all the years anyone can remember. A seep that was old when the Romans built their roads, and older still when the first people came to this valley and found the water rising from the earth and decided to stay. You hang the pot on its hook and swing it over the growing flame, and then you stand and wrap your hands around a clay cup of warm broth left from last night's supper, a broth made from the bones of the rabbit that Thomas found at the edge of the common, and that you boiled with dried peas and a leek from the garden, and the piece of salt pork that has flavoured a week of meals, and will flavour another week before it is finally consumed. The cup is rough against your palms, and the warmth travels up through your hands and into your wrists and arms, and you watch the steam rise from the surface of the broth and disappear into the dark rafters, where the bundles of dried herbs hang from their twine, rosemary and thyme and sage that you cut in the summer and tied and hung to dry for the winter months, when fresh herbs are only a memory, and the food needs something green to remind the tongue of summer. The children will wake soon, but not yet, and in this narrow window of solitude you are not a widow or a mother or a woman who must draw water and mend stockings and walk to the common and sweep the floor and stir the pot. You are simply a person standing in a dark cottage watching steam rise from a cup and feeling the warmth spread through your hands while the fire grows brighter and the first birds begin to stir in the hedgerows. Your body remembers this stillness from yesterday, and from the day before, and from all the days that have come since the wet spring of 1674, when the fever took your husband and left you with 3 children and a cottage, and the necessity of rising first each morning to coax the fire back to life. The memory of him standing beside you in the mornings is soft and distant now, like a mark on old wood worn smooth by years of handling, a mark that once meant something and now is just a variation in the grain. Noticeable only if you stop and look and run your finger over the surface and think about what made it. The light changes from black to deep blue outside the single window, and you see the outline of the hawthorn tree at the edge of the garden appear as a darker shape against the dark sky, its bare branches like cracks in the fabric of the night, the same branches you saw yesterday and the day before, and that you will see tomorrow if the grey light comes and the world continues in its slow turning. You hear the first bird call from somewhere beyond the garden wall, the same robin that called yesterday and that will call tomorrow, its voice clear and high and seeming to ask a question that no one answers, a question about the coming of the day and the presence of the cat in the miller's barn and the likelihood of finding worms in the soft earth near the midden after a night of rain. The robin calls again and another bird answers from further away. A blackbird with a lower, richer call that sounds like water running over smooth stones, and then a third bird joins at a fourth. And soon the whole hedgerow is alive with the sound of birds waking and calling to each other, and establishing the boundaries of their small territories among the hawthorn and the elder and the bramble that grows thick along the lane. You finish the broth and set the cup on the table, and you move to the hearth to add another log, this time a piece of elm that will burn slowly and steadily through the morning while you prepare the breakfast and wake the children and begin the long, slow round of tasks that will fill the day until the evening comes and the fire is banked and the children climb the ladder to the loft and you sit in the quiet darkness listening to the rain or the wind or the silence and thinking about nothing in particular. The loft ladder creaks under small feet and you know that Anne is awake and coming down, her feet finding the rungs in the darkness with the same certainty that yours did, missing the 5th rung by habit, because you taught her to miss it when she was old enough to climb the ladder on her own, and you wanted to preserve the quiet of the early morning for yourself. She appears at the bottom of the ladder, with her hair tangled from sleep and her woolen kirtle pulled on crooked, her face still soft and puffy in the way of children who have slept deeply, and she says good morning in the exact tone she used yesterday and will use tomorrow, a tone that is quiet and respectful and carries within it the acknowledgement that you have been awake before her and have lit the fire and prepared the way for the day to begin. She moves to the hearth without being told and begins setting out the wooden bowls, 3 for the children and 1 for you, each with its own pattern of knife marks and dark stains, and the small chip in the rim of the 3rd bowl that catches on the cloth when you wipe it clean. The bowls are the same bowls that held yesterday's breakfast and the day before's, and that will hold tomorrow's and all the breakfasts after that, until one of them cracks or breaks and you must trade for a replacement or do without. And the children will eat from 3 bowls instead of 4, and no one will complain, because complaining does not make a new bowl appear. Thomas comes down next with his slow, careful steps and his hands gripping the sides of the ladder, and he sits on the bench and stares at the fire without speaking. A habit that has been his since the winter after the burial, and that you have learned to accept as a part of him, like the color of his eyes and the shape of his hands and the slight roughness in his breath, that you listened for in the night. His shepherd's crook leans against the wall by the door where he left it yesterday evening, when he came home from the common, with mud on his hem and a stone with a ring of white quartz in his pocket, a stone that now sits on the mantel with the other 6 stones in a row, that catches the firelight in the evenings and reminds you that your son is still a child, despite his serious face and his quiet ways. Little Mary calls down from the loft that she cannot find her other shoe, a call you answer with the same patient words you use every morning, telling her to feel along the edge of the straw mattress where it always slips during the night, and where it will be waiting for her, just as it was yesterday and the day before and all the days stretching back to when she first learned to put on her own shoes. You hear her small hands patting and searching, and then the soft sound of satisfaction as her fingers find the missing shoe wedged between the mattress and the wall, exactly where it always is. And then you hear her feet on the ladder rungs coming down more quickly than her brother, but less certainly than her sister. A small thump and pause as she navigates the descent with 1 shoe on and 1 shoe clutched in her hand. The children are all in the main room now, and you pour the warmed broth into the 4 wooden bowls, the liquid dark and steaming and carrying the smell of rabbit and leek and the faint mineral taste of the well water that you drew yesterday afternoon. You break yesterday's rye bread into pieces and drop them into each bowl, watching the dark crust soften and absorb the broth and become something tender and warm. The same bread and the same broth and the same bowls that held yesterday's breakfast, and that will hold tomorrow's and the day after's and all the breakfasts until the bread runs out, and you must bake more or trade for more or do without. Anne says the simple prayer her father taught her, the words slightly different in her mouth than in his memory, because she is 11 years old, and her voice is changing, and she has added small pauses and inflections that are her own. The prayer ends and the children pick up their wooden spoons, and the morning meal passes in quiet chewing sounds, and the scrape of wood against wood, and the occasional soft slurp when someone takes in a mouthful of broth that is still too hot. When the bowls are empty and the last pieces of softened bread have been scraped from the bottom, you send Anne to fetch water from the barrel outside, because the bucket by the door is nearly empty, and you will need more water for the washing and the cooking and the watering of the garden later in the day. She pulls on her wooden pattens and takes the smaller bucket and steps out into the grey morning light. And you hear the door close behind her, and then the sound of her feet on the packed earth of the yard, and then the creak of the barrel lid being lifted and the splash of water being dipped. You turn to Thomas and help him into his patched wool coat, the same coat that was his father's, and that you cut down and re-sewed with stitches that are not as neat as a tailor's would be, but that hold the fabric together and keep the wind from finding its way to his skin. You smooth the collar, and you do not say anything about his father or about how the coat still carries the faint smell of the man who wore it first, a smell of wood smoke and sheep, and the particular sweat of a body that worked hard every day and slept well every night and woke each morning ready to work again. Thomas looks up at you with his serious face and his grey eyes, and he says nothing, but he leans into your hand for just a moment before stepping back and picking up his shepherd's crook from where it leans against the wall by the door. The crook is the same hazel stick that his father peeled smooth by this same fire, the bark stripped away and long curling ribbons that Mary collected and pretended were ribbons for her hair. Ribbons that you saved in a small basket for reasons you could not explain, even to yourself. The stick is worn smooth where Thomas's hand grips it, and there is a small notch near the top where his father carved a mark to show that the stick belonged to this family, and to this boy, and to no one else, a mark that will remain long after the stick is passed to another boy or left to lean in a corner and gather dust. You take Mary's hand and you walk with Thomas down the lane toward the common, the same lane you walked yesterday and the day before, the 347 steps that live in your legs rather than your mind. The ground is wet from the night's rain and your wooden pattens leave small marks in the soft earth, marks that will fade as the day goes on and other feet pass over them and the sun behind the grey clouds dries the surface. You pass the miller's fence where the brambles grow heavy with blackberries that no one picks because the miller's wife guards them with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, and you pass the old oak where the crow sits on its top branch, watching the lane with one black eye that seems to contain an ancient and indifferent wisdom. Thomas walks ahead of you with his crook over his shoulder and his too large coat flapping around his thin legs, and you watch him until he reaches the common and joins the other boys and the shepherd and the flock of sheep that will spend the day moving slowly from one grazing patch to another. You turn back toward the cottage with Mary's hand in yours, and the wind at your face and the grey sky above you, and you walk the 347 steps in reverse, passing the old oak and the miller's fence and the hedgerows thick with hawthorn and elder, and the pale green leaves of the honeysuckle. The cottage appears at the end of the lane, with smoke rising from its chimney in a thin grey column that leans slightly to the east, and you can see Anne in the garden bending over the rows of cabbages and turnips, her small figure moving slowly among the green leaves and the brown earth. Mary lets go of your hand and runs to the stone bench where her collection of pebbles waits in the pattern she left yesterday evening, and she sits down and begins to rearrange them into a new pattern that only she understands. You stand in the doorway of the cottage and you look back down the lane toward the common that is now hidden by the hedgerows and the curve of the land, and you think about Thomas walking behind the sheep, and Anne in the garden, and Mary with her pebbles and the pot waiting on the fire, and the water that needs to be drawn from the well, and the washing that needs to be done, and the mending that waits in the basket by the hearth. The day stretches out before you, like all the days that have come before and all the days that will come after. A long grey road, with no turns and no surprises, a road that you will walk one step at a time until the evening comes and the fire is banked, and the children climb the ladder to the loft, and you sit in the quiet darkness listening to the sounds of the night and thinking about nothing in particular. You step inside the cottage and you close the door behind you, and you move to the hearth where the fire burns steadily and the pot bubbles on its hook, and the whole small world of your household waits for you to set it in motion again. The same world that waited yesterday and that will wait tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. A world made of small tasks and quiet moments and the slow, steady rhythm of a life that continues whether you are ready for it or not.